Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and History. Imagine yourself standing on a ridge as the sun sinks behind the jagged peaks of the Carpathian Mountains. Mist curls up from the forests like smoke rising from unseen fires, and the air feels heavy with the weight of centuries. Below, villages huddle in valleys where roofs creak in the wind, and dogs bark at shadows that may or may not be there. You hear the distant toll of a church bell echoing across the hills, and even now, in this imagined place, it sets your heart racing. History, legend, and fear blur together in these lands. Tonight, we travel into their heart, and a small warning. You probably won't survive this story, not if you were a peasant in 15th century Wallachia, nor if you stumbled through a graveyard in Serbia 200 years later, nor even if you wandered into a London bookshop in 1897 and opened a novel bound in blood-red cloth. But don't worry, you're safe in your bed. Safe enough, at least, to listen. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, tell me your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where these stories drift to and who's out there listening, whether you're under the night sky of Eastern Europe, in a busy American city, or somewhere far away with the day just breaking. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The story begins in the year 1431. That was when a child named Vlad was born in the fortified town of Sighișoara, deep in Transylvania, though his family ruled over the neighbouring land of Wallachia. His father, Vlad II, had sworn himself to the Order of the Dragon, a knightly fellowship created by the Hungarian king Sigismund. The order was dedicated to fighting the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. Their symbol was a coiled dragon, and it hung heavily on banners and breastplates. In the local tongue, Dracula meant both dragon and devil. Thus, the child who would later terrify Europe entered the world already marked by a name that whispered of monsters. He was Dracula, the son of the dragon, or perhaps the son of the devil. Names matter, and this one would linger far beyond his lifetime. Europe at this moment trembled on the edge of change. The 15th century was an age of shifting power, where kingdoms rose and fell in the shadow of the Ottomans pressing hard into the Balkans. Wallachia, a principality squeezed between larger powers, was both shield and battleground. Its princes ruled precariously, balancing loyalty to Hungary one year and to the Sultan the next, depending on which way the winds of war blew. For a boy like Vlad, this meant his childhood was not one of simple games or safe lessons, but of watching the treachery of politics unfold before his eyes. His father, Vlad II, ruled uneasily, often forced to appease both neighbours and enemies, and the young Vlad would soon discover what it meant to be a pawn in the great game of survival. By 1442, when Vlad was around 11 years old, he and his younger brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman Court. This was a common practice, a way for powerful empires to guarantee obedience from their vassals. The boys were taken south, across the Danube, into a world both foreign and dangerous. There they lived in the shadow of Sultan Murad II and his son, the future Mehmed the Conqueror. Imagine a boy with sharp eyes, already suspicious, learning Turkish customs, listening to the chants of the muezzin, watching executions in palace courtyards. Vlad absorbed these lessons like bitter medicine. If the Ottomans meant to tame him, they failed. Instead, they carved into him a hatred and also taught him how power is wielded without hesitation. But for now, in these opening moments of his story, remember him as a boy. The villagers might have whispered about the prince who bore the devil's name, about his piercing stare, about the strange destiny surrounding him. He would become the figure later called Vlad Țepeș, Vlad the Impaler. Yet long before his deeds were committed to print, long before his name became a character in a novel, He was simply a child in a turbulent age, one shaped by fear, faith, and the razor's edge of survival. These beginnings set the stage for how a man could transform into a legend, and how a legend could eventually blur into something darker, something that would live on not in history alone, but in myth and in nightmares. Vlad's birth in 1431 came at a moment when the world around him was in constant tension. To understand how a child could grow into the man who would be remembered as Vlad the Impaler, one must first picture the world into which he entered. The small, fortified town of Sighișoara sat high in Transylvania, its narrow streets twisting among steep rooftops, its church spires pointing skyward, as if to remind the faithful that salvation was never far from thought. Transylvania was a patchwork land, its people German, Hungarian, and Romanian, its allegiances shifting with every treaty or war. It was both frontier and crossroads, a place where merchants passed, soldiers marched, and legends lingered longer than truth. Vlad was born the second son of Vlad II Dracula, a man whose life was already steeped in both ambition and danger. His father's title Dracula did not yet carry the sinister hiss it later would. At the time, it meant dragon, for Vlad II had joined the Order of the Dragon, a Christian brotherhood sworn to resist the advance of the Ottoman Turks. But in the local Romanian tongue, Drac could mean both dragon and devil. That double meaning clung to the family like smoke. Thus, when his son was born, the child carried not only the blood of princes, but a name that seemed to tether him to darker forces: Dracula, the son of Dracula. Names in the 15th century mattered more than we might realize. In a world where most peasants lived and died anonymous, nobles and princes clung fiercely to dynastic names, each syllable heavy with history. For young Vlad, his name whispered both nobility and dread. It tied him to a father who owed allegiance to kings, yet also to an order that demanded ferocity. And it tied him to a land caught forever between great powers. Wallachia, which his family ruled, was not an easy place to govern. Stretching between the Carpathian Mountains to the north and the Danube River to the south, it was both fortress and corridor. Hungary loomed to one side, the Ottoman Empire to the other. To the west, German merchants controlled trade routes and printed the earliest stories that would later tarnish Vlad's reputation. To rule here was to forever walk a tightrope over a pit of enemies. From his earliest years, Vlad was not coddled as a child of privilege, but instructed in the brutal calculus of power. Chronicles suggest he was trained in the arts expected of a prince: riding, hunting, swordsmanship, and the constant drilling of discipline. Yet the shadow of politics fell early across his path. His father, Vlad II, oscillated between loyalty to Hungary and uneasy tribute to the Ottoman sultans. This balancing act meant that safety was always an illusion. The 1,432nd and 1,442nd in Eastern Europe were scarred by conflict. Ottoman armies pressed northward, raiding villages and fortresses. Hungarian kings rallied crusades to push them back. Wallachian princes like Vlad's father stood as buffer lords, often sacrificed in the schemes of greater men. It was in this world that Vlad learned his first lessons that survival demanded not just strength, but cunning, cruelty, and the ability to out-terrorize one's enemies. Historians believe that Vlad's mother may have been connected to the Moldavian court, another principality entangled in the web of regional politics. If so, this meant young Vlad's bloodline connected him to multiple thrones, increasing both his claim to rule and the dangers he faced. Rival claimants were many, and assassinations frequent. Childhood for a Wallachian prince was not about toys or laughter, but about listening carefully at banquets, noting who whispered against whom, and wondering who might poison your cup. By 1436, when Vlad was still a boy, his father seized the Wallachian throne. This victory, however, bound the family ever tighter to obligations that would later tear them apart. To secure his place, Vlad II pledged loyalty to the Hungarians, while also promising tribute to the Ottomans. That double oath was unsustainable. Both neighbours demanded more than he could give. The child Vlad, watching from the side of the court, would have seen emissaries from distant lands arrive. Hungarian knights in gleaming armour, Ottoman envoys in silken robes, merchants from Saxon towns carrying ledgers. Each brought gifts or threats, each demanded loyalty. Even at this young age, the boy began to internalize a lesson that would shape him. Appearances matter as much as deeds, and to rule is to manage fear, both your own and others. Legends claim that Vlad, even as a youth, displayed a fierce temper and a brooding intensity. While such anecdotes are often coloured by hindsight, they fit the portrait that emerges of a boy shaped early by instability. He was no idle dreamer. He was, from the start, a watcher absorbing cruelty, betrayal, and power dynamics as though they were the only language spoken in his world. Time moved quickly for a child in such circumstances. By the early 1442, his father's position had become perilous. The Ottomans pressed harder for tribute, while Hungarian kings grew suspicious of his wavering loyalty. In 1442, when Vlad was around 11, his father made a decision that altered the boy's life forever. To secure Wallachia's fragile peace, he sent Vlad and his younger brother Radu as hostages to the Ottoman Court. Imagine the journey. Two boys leaving the misty mountains of Transylvania, riding south across the Danube and entering a land of mosques, domes and soldiers unlike any they had known. In Edirne, the Ottoman capital at the time, they were paraded as guests yet treated as pawns. Their lives were guarantees of their father's obedience. If he betrayed his promises, their blood would pay the price. For Vlad, this was a crucible. Hostage life did not mean chains and cells, but it did mean constant surveillance. He learned Turkish, studied Ottoman tactics, and watched as prisoners were executed for disobedience. He grew close enough to the future Mehmed II, who would one day conquer Constantinople, to understand his mind. Yet while his brother Radu adapted, even thriving in Ottoman company, Vlad stewed in resentment. These years forged in him both hatred and mastery. He observed how absolute power was exercised and how terror could be wielded like a weapon sharper than any blade. The boy who had been born with a fateful name, Dracula, was becoming something far darker. His early lessons in politics and survival, his father's dangerous balancing acts, and his years as an Ottoman hostage all sharpened him. By the time he returned to Wallachia in his late teens, he was no longer merely the son of Dracula. He was a young man forged in suspicion and shadow, one who would one day rule not by compromise, but by instilling fear so deep it would echo through centuries. The year was 1442, and the Danube shimmered beneath a pale sky. Along its banks, two boys, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, were taken southward under armed escort. To the Wallachian court, this was called diplomacy. To the boys, it was captivity in everything but name. They were hostages, insurance tokens placed in the vault of empire, held not for who they were, but for what their father might dare to do. For the Ottomans, this practice was common. For Wallachia, it was a chain that bound loyalty tighter than treaties ever could. At the heart of the Ottoman realm lay Edirne, the capital before Constantinople fell. The city was a place of domes and courtyards, of fountains and tiled mosques, of soldiers drilling in ordered ranks, while muezzins called the faithful to prayer. For Vlad, who had grown up among Gothic churches and wooden fortresses, this was another world entirely. The air smelled of spices unfamiliar, the streets thrummed with languages he barely understood, and the power of the Sultan pressed down like heat from the sun. Vlad was around 11 when he entered this world, and already wary beyond his years. Children are resilient, but they also remember deeply. Each day in Edirne etched itself into his mind like cuts into stone. He watched executions, beheadings carried out swiftly in courtyards, impalements on wooden stakes that were eerily similar to the punishments he would later perfect. He saw prisoners paraded, foreign envoys humbled, and nobles bowing low before the Sultan. Here, in the palace of Murad II, and later in the household of the young Prince Mehmed, he learned not only languages and courtly manners, but also the brutal arithmetic of empire. Obedience meant survival, disobedience meant annihilation. His brother Radu, softer in temperament, adapted differently. Where Vlad seethed in silence, Radu observed with a smile, ingratiating himself with tutors, soldiers, and even the Sultan's heir. Later, chroniclers would call him Radu cel Frumos Radu, the handsome, for his charm and beauty. He would grow comfortable at court, even loyal. Vlad, by contrast, was iron-hardening under pressure. His gaze, sharp and unyielding, made him seem older than his years. The two brothers, bonded by blood, began to diverge down paths that would later put them on opposite sides of history. Still, for all his hatred, Vlad learned. Hostages were not meant to be broken, but molded. He studied Turkish and Arabic. He trained in archery and horseback riding under Ottoman masters. He learned the Quran's verses, though his faith remained Christian, and absorbed the rhythms of Islamic prayer. He memorized military strategy, siege tactics, and how orders could command not just armies, but entire populations. To a boy so intent on survival, knowledge was both shield and sword. The Ottomans themselves were a study in contrasts. They were ruthless in conquest, yet disciplined in administration. Their empire stretched across Anatolia, the Balkans, and was pressing ever deeper into Europe. At Edirne, Vlad glimpsed a machine of power that dwarfed Wallachia's fragile courts. He saw how absolute authority looked in practice, how terror could be codified into governance. If his father's rule had seemed precarious, the Sultan's seemed eternal. This vision of domination would stay with Vlad, a model he both loathed and secretly admired. Life as a hostage was not constant torment. There were lessons, games, meals shared with other young captives from distant lands. There were evenings of music, instruments plucked in courtyards lit by oil lamps. But for Vlad, these moments never softened the edge of captivity. Behind every kindness lurked a reminder. His life depended on his father's obedience. Should Wallachia betray the Sultan, punishment would fall first on the sons, not the father. This knowledge gnawed at him day and night, shaping his thoughts into hard knots of anger and suspicion. The defining relationship of these years was with Mehmed, the Sultan's son, close in age to Vlad. The two trained side by side, studied the same texts, and sparred in military drills. Yet where Mehmed was destined for empire, Vlad was destined for pawnhood. Their bond was complicated rivals, companions, reluctant brothers. Later, when Mehmed conquered Constantinople in 1453 and became Mehmed the Conqueror, Vlad would recall these childhood encounters with both familiarity and venom. He had known the conqueror as a boy, and he had learned at his side the ruthlessness that would characterize both their reigns. There are stories difficult to separate fact from legend that Vlad witnessed the methods of Ottoman punishment firsthand. Impalement was used sparingly by the Turks, but enough that a boy with sharp eyes would have seen it. The horror of a body slowly sliding down a stake, life draining hour by hour, was not something easily forgotten. Later, when Vlad unleashed forests of impaled corpses across Wallachia, he may have been repaying lessons learned in Edirne, adopting the very tools once used to frighten him. Time passed, and with each year the boys grew. Radu became fluent, graceful and favoured. Vlad remained darker, brooding, and difficult to tame. Reports filtered back to Wallachia of wars, of alliances, of his father's shifting loyalties. Each rumour was a reminder that their lives hung in balance. If Vlad II betrayed the Sultan, these sons would pay. But fate spun differently. Vlad II would eventually be killed by his own rivals, and the throne of Wallachia would fall into chaos. When Vlad was finally released in the mid-1442, still barely into manhood, he returned home a changed figure. He was no longer a boy, no longer even a mere prince. He had been remade in captivity into something harder, sharper, colder. His eyes had seen empires from the inside. His mind had absorbed both hatred and strategy. His heart carried scars invisible but deep. The hostage years did not break him. They forged him into the man who would later terrify Europe. And yet, history has a way of exaggerating even the darkest truths. The chronicles that survive often paint him as if he emerged fully monstrous from Edirne, already plotting forests of impalements. Reality is subtler. He was a youth, battered by circumstance, marked by betrayal, moulded by the lessons of empire. He carried wounds of the soul that would later bloom into cruelty. His story was still only beginning. In those years as a hostage, the legend of Dracula had not yet taken form. He was merely a boy bound by politics, forced to learn from enemies he despised. But in those palace courtyards, among the shadows of domes and minarets, seeds were planted. Seeds of fear, seeds of vengeance, seeds of a worldview in which trust was weakness and terror was the truest coin of power. These seeds, once sown, would grow into the forests of the impaled that made him infamous. And so, the hostage years closed not with resolution, but with transformation. Vlad returned to Wallachia scarred, but alive. The boy who had once been the son of Dracula was on his way to becoming Vlad Țepeș, the Impaler, the prince who ruled by fear, the figure whose name would echo across centuries until it merged with myth itself. The boy who had left Wallachia as a hostage now returned as a young man, scarred, sharpened, and restless. It was the mid-1442, a time of chaos across the Balkans. When Vlad III set foot once more on Wallachian soil, he returned not into peace but into turmoil. His father, Vlad II Dracula, had been slain. His elder brother Mircea had been blinded with red-hot irons and buried alive by rival boyars. The throne of Wallachia was once again a prize contested by factions, neighbours, and foreign powers. Into this furnace stepped a youth barely out of his teens, whose years in Ottoman captivity had taught him the cruelty of politics, the fragility of life, and the cold uses of terror. The Wallachia of his return was a land both fertile and fragile. Forests pressed against villages, rivers marked boundaries, and castles clung to hillsides. The peasants tilled their fields, but above them nobles plotted. The boyars, the landed aristocracy, had long been both the strength and weakness of Wallachia. Their loyalty shifted like the wind, their ambitions as sharp as their swords. Many had conspired in the death of Vlad's father. Many whispered about whether this son, forged in Ottoman fire, could be trusted at all. To understand the climate Vlad stepped into, one must picture a chessboard with too many players. To the north lay Hungary, its kings eager to keep Wallachia as a buffer against Ottoman expansion. To the south lay the Ottoman Empire itself, determined to secure control of the Danube frontier. Within Wallachia, rival claimants to the throne vied for power, each backed by boyars, mercenaries, or foreign gold. It was a land where betrayal was not an exception, but the expected currency of politics. Vlad's first attempt to claim the throne came in 1448, when he was barely 17. The timing was precarious. His sponsor was the Ottomans, who wished to install him as their puppet after the catastrophic defeat of Hungarian forces at the Battle of Varna. That battle, fought in November 1444, had been a turning point. Christian armies, led by King Władysław of Poland and Hungary and the renowned general John Hunyadi, marched to repel the Ottomans. Instead, they were crushed, the king slain, and Hunyadi forced into retreat. The Ottoman victory left the region shaken, and Vlad, still in their shadow, was sent north to seize his inheritance. But the throne of Wallachia was not easily won. Rival claimants, including Vladislav II, held power with Hungarian support. Vlad's first reign lasted only a matter of months before he was forced into exile. It was a baptism by fire, to be installed by one empire, rejected by his own nobles, and chased out by another empire's allies. Yet even in this failure, Vlad absorbed lessons. He learned that alliances were fragile, that boyar loyalty was treacherous, and that to rule Wallachia would demand more than princely blood. It would demand fear so profound that betrayal became unthinkable. Exile for Vlad meant wandering through the courts of Moldavia and Transylvania, where he bided his time, watching and waiting. In Moldavia, under the protection of his uncle Bogdan II, he learned further lessons of survival. But even here, treachery followed. His uncle was assassinated in 1451, and Vlad once more found himself adrift, hunted by enemies, his life hanging by threads. Survival became a habit, a rhythm, a constant game of evasion and vengeance. By 1456, opportunity struck again. John Hunyadi, now Hungary's great regent and commander, launched another campaign against the Ottomans. During this shifting of armies, Vlad seized his chance, with Hungarian backing this time, ironically, from the same side that had ousted him years earlier. He marched into Wallachia and claimed the throne for a second time. This reign would last far longer, and it was in these years that Vlad began to carve his true reputation. He returned not as a timid claimant, but as a hardened young prince determined to rule absolutely. From his first days, he set about crushing the boyars who had betrayed his father. In one infamous episode, he invited the nobility to a feast on Easter Sunday, 1457. After a lavish meal, he had his soldiers seize the guests. The elderly were impaled on stakes. The younger nobles were forced on a grueling march to Poenari fortress, where they were made to rebuild the crumbling stronghold. Few survived. To Vlad, this was not cruelty for its own sake. It was justice, vengeance, and most importantly, a message. Betrayal would be answered not with negotiation, but with annihilation. The peasants, weary of boyar corruption, may have seen in Vlad a ruler who punished the powerful and enforced order. Indeed, some chronicles suggest common folk admired his iron hand, for under his reign roads were safer, theft diminished, and justice swift. But for the nobles and rivals who opposed him, Vlad became a nightmare. Wallachia itself began to transform under his rule. Fortresses were strengthened, troops were drilled, punishments were displayed in public squares with such theatrical brutality that fear spread faster than rumour. Impalement became his signature. He perfected it not just as execution, but as spectacle rows of corpses lining roads, impaled at varying heights to create a grim forest of human suffering. The message was clear. Enemies of the prince would not merely die, they would become warnings etched into the landscape. These acts shocked contemporaries, and stories began to spill beyond Wallachia's borders. German merchants in Transylvanian towns, angered by Vlad's trade restrictions, printed pamphlets describing his horrors. One such tale told of a foreign merchant who cheated Wallachian customers. Vlad had him impaled, but left his gold untouched, declaring that theft would never be tolerated in his land. To some, this was justice, to others, savagery. Either way, the story spread, feeding his reputation as both tyrant and stern ruler. In these years, Vlad's name Dracula took on darker resonance. No longer just the son of the dragon, it became linked with devilry. His enemies whispered of him as a fiend. His allies muttered his name with fear. The very sound of Dracula began to conjure images of cruelty, impalement, and forests of the dead. Politically, Vlad's second reign was defined by balancing once again between Hungary and the Ottomans, but this time he played the game with far more ferocity. He paid tribute when necessary, withheld it when he dared, and prepared his land for war. In 1462, he would launch his most audacious campaign against the Ottomans, but those events belonged to the next chapter. For now, the return to Wallachia marked the transformation of a once hostage boy into a prince who ruled by fear. It is important, in the calm of tonight's retelling, to remember that this cruelty was not merely madness. In the 15th century Balkans, where empires clashed and borders shifted weekly, survival often required horrors modern minds can scarcely fathom. Vlad III had learned in the Ottoman Court that terror was a language of power. Upon his return, he spoke it fluently, carving his words into flesh and bone until no one in Wallachia could mistake his intent. The boy was gone, the prince had returned, and the legend of Dracula had begun to walk. The stories that survive from Vlad's reign are thick with blood and shadow, and none more so than those of the impalements. To this day, the word itself conjures images too stark to dismiss. Yet in 15th century Wallachia, impalement was not merely a punishment. Under Vlad, it became an art of terror, a spectacle designed to burn itself into memory. When people later whispered the name Dracula, this was what they remembered most: the forests of the impaled. The practice of impalement was not unique to Vlad. It had been used across the Ottoman Empire, where he first saw it in the courtyards of Edirne. It existed in parts of Eastern Europe and Asia as well, but Vlad elevated it, or degraded it depending on one's view, into a defining symbol of his rule. Where others used it sparingly, he wielded it on a scale meant to overwhelm the senses. Imagine a road leading to a Wallachian fortress. As travellers approached, they would find the air heavy with the smell of decay. Birds wheeled overhead, and dogs barked from a distance. Along the roadside, row upon row of bodies loomed, each impaled upon sharpened stakes. Some were fresh, blood still dripping. Others had been there for days, weeks, even months, reduced to skeletal forms clinging to wood. Tall stakes bore nobles, their garments fluttering in the wind. Shorter stakes carried peasants, criminals, and captured soldiers. Together, they formed a grim forest of human suffering, a landscape crafted as much for the living as for the dying. The method itself was cruelly precise. A stake was sharpened to a point and sometimes greased. Victims were hoisted, often through the torso or lower body, and gravity did the rest. Death came slowly, sometimes over hours, sometimes days. The horror was not only in the pain but in the sight. Villagers who stumbled upon such a display did not forget it. Armies who marched into Wallachia saw not a battlefield, but a graveyard already prepared for them. Vlad's forests were living warnings. This land was defended not by treaties or forts, but by fear itself. Chroniclers from Saxon towns in Transylvania, often hostile to Vlad, spread these tales in lurid detail. One account claimed he impaled 20,000 Ottoman soldiers along the banks of the Danube, a number likely exaggerated, but powerful nonetheless. Another pamphlet told of how he once left an entire field covered with staked corpses, so dense that it resembled a ghastly orchard. The exaggeration mattered less than the effect. To readers in Germany, these stories painted Vlad not merely as a tyrant, but as a monster whose cruelty defied imagination. Yet within Wallachia, reactions were more complicated. To peasants terrorized by bandits and boyar corruption, Vlad's cruelty against the powerful could feel like justice. One story, repeated often, described how he placed a golden cup by a public fountain in Târgoviște, his capital. The cup remained untouched for years, so great was the fear of theft under his rule. No merchant dared steal it, no peasant risked a hand upon it. Such was the paradox of Vlad's justice. Cruel to the point of nightmare, yet effective in a land long racked by chaos. His enemies, of course, saw only madness. Hungarian chroniclers wrote of him as a tyrant beyond reason. German printers illustrated him dining among impaled victims, calmly eating while their bodies writhed around him. Whether he truly did this or not, the image endured. It suggested not only cruelty, but a kind of cold enjoyment, the mark of a man who had stepped beyond human morality. The forests of the impaled were not random acts, they were strategy. Vlad understood what modern leaders might call psychological warfare. He lacked the vast armies of Hungary or the Ottomans. His fortresses were small, his resources limited, but with terror he could make enemies hesitate, retreat, or crumble. Armies that marched into his land found themselves disoriented, demoralized, sometimes turning back before battle was even joined. In this sense, impalement was not merely execution, it was a weapon, aimed not at bodies but at minds. One of the most infamous episodes occurred during the campaign of 1462, when Sultan Mehmed II led a massive army into Wallachia to crush Vlad once and for all. As the Ottomans approached Târgoviște, they found outside the city a spectacle beyond comprehension, a field of 20,000 corpses impaled in ordered rows. The sight horrified even the battle-hardened Mehmed. His soldiers, accustomed to cruelty, recoiled. It is said the Sultan, staring at the carnage, muttered that one could not defeat a man who did such things, only fear him. The campaign faltered, and Vlad's legend grew. But terror is a double-edged sword. While it kept enemies at bay, it also hardened opposition. Neighbouring rulers, reading the lurid pamphlets printed in Saxon towns, began to see Vlad as unstable, dangerous even to allies. His reputation outpaced his deeds, becoming a myth of cruelty that travelled far beyond Wallachia. By the time of his eventual downfall, his enemies scarcely needed to fabricate tales. His own methods had already painted him in blood. It is important, in recounting these horrors, to remember the world Vlad inhabited. The 15th century was not an age of gentle rule. Punishments were brutal across Europe. Hangings, burnings, quarterings. But Vlad's use of impalement, its scale and spectacle, set him apart. He embraced cruelty not as necessity alone, but as philosophy. Fear was his fortress, terror his garrison. And in that philosophy, he achieved what castles and armies could not. A legend that endured long after his body was gone. The forests of the impaled echo forward into later centuries because they blur the line between history and nightmare. Villagers who told stories of them may have embroidered details, but the essence was true. German pamphlets, printed cheaply and spread across Europe, carried the tales further, turning Vlad into a bogeyman. These pamphlets, among the first mass media of the age, ensured that his cruelty would not die in local memory. Instead, it became continental, even global. The Dracula of history was born not only in deeds, but in the ink of hostile printers. And yet, among his own people, another layer of memory lingered. To some, Vlad was not a monster, but a just ruler. They remembered safety on roads, justice in villages, order where chaos once reigned. They remembered a prince who punished corruption and did not spare the mighty. To these voices, his forests were terrible but necessary, the price of stability in a land forever caught between empires. Thus, Vlad's legacy was always double-faced. Hero to some, demon to others. But the forests of the impaled ensured that whichever view one took, he was never forgotten. The name Dracula was now inseparable from blood and fear, a symbol that would endure long beyond the 15th century. From these forests grew not only terror but myth. And from myth, eventually the figure who would stalk Victorian novels and modern screens alike. The forests of the impaled were not the end of Vlad's story. They were a chapter, a dreadful bloom in the larger garden of fear that defined his reign. But they were the chapter most remembered, the one that made his name echo across Europe. When Bram Stoker, centuries later, sought a figure to anchor his novel, the legend of these forests lay ready, waiting, a seed planted long ago in blood and cruelty. And so, under the pale skies of Wallachia, with forests swaying in the wind and corpses swaying on their stakes, the story of Vlad III entered the realm of legend. It was here, in the mingling of history and horror, that Dracula ceased to be merely a prince and became instead something far darker, something eternal. The name alone was enough to ripple through the ages. Dracula. Long before it became a household word associated with vampires, it was already a title weighted with meanings, both noble and sinister. To trace how this name evolved from the family crest of a 15th century Wallachian prince into a symbol of blood and shadow is to trace how history itself reshapes memory, turning a man into a myth and a myth into something eternal. The story begins with Vlad's father, Vlad II Dracula. In 1431, the very year his son was born, the elder Vlad was inducted into the Order of the Dragon, a knightly brotherhood founded by Sigismund of Luxembourg, the King of Hungary, and later, Holy Roman Emperor. The order had been established in 1408 with a singular purpose: to defend Christendom against the advancing Ottoman Turks. Its symbol was a coiled dragon, fierce and watchful, emblazoned on banners and seals. For Vlad II, membership was both an honor and a strategic necessity. It gave him legitimacy as ruler of Wallachia, but it also bound him to a crusading cause that demanded both loyalty and blood. From this association, Vlad II gained the byname Dracul, meaning the dragon in medieval Romanian. But here language played a fateful trick. The word drac in Romanian carried a double meaning. In church, Latin and heraldic speech, Draco was the dragon, a noble emblem of strength and vigilance. But in local vernacular, Drac also meant the devil. Villagers muttered the name with a different inflection, perhaps not always distinguishing between beast and demon. To call a man Dracul could mean dragon, or it could mean devil, depending on who spoke and how. Thus, when Vlad III was born, he inherited not only blood and throne, but also a name already heavy with ambiguity. He was Dracula, literally, the son of Dracul, the son of the dragon. Yet to many ears, it also rang as the son of the devil. That ambiguity followed him like a shadow. In the courts of Hungary and the halls of Transylvanian merchants, the name carried prestige. It tied Vlad to the knightly order, to vows sworn before kings. In the villages of Wallachia, however, where superstition ran as deep as the rivers, it stirred unease. A prince named for the devil himself, what might that mean for the land he ruled? Even before Vlad III committed his first act of brutality, his very name carried menace. It is no coincidence that names carry such power in folklore. In Eastern European superstition, to know the true name of a spirit was to hold power over it. Names conjured identities, and identities lingered even beyond the grave. For Vlad, his name was a prophecy. Every act of cruelty he committed was magnified by the echo of that syllable, Dracula. To enemies, it was confirmation of his evil. To peasants, it was a whispered warning. To later chroniclers, it was the perfect label for a man who blurred the line between ruler and monster. Pamphlets printed in the late 15th century seized upon the name with relish. German printers, hostile to Vlad because of his conflicts with Saxon merchants, spread woodcut illustrations of the prince seated at a table, calmly dining among the impaled. Across the top, captions identified him, Dracul Wader or Dracula. To audiences in Nuremberg or Vienna, the name rolled off the tongue with exotic menace. It sounded foreign, strange, threatening exactly the qualities needed to make a bogeyman believable. Slavic chronicles likewise emphasized the name's infernal resonance. To them, Dracula was not merely a political figure, but a scourge, an embodiment of cruelty itself. Over time, the name detached from precise genealogy. While Dracul had been a specific honorific tied to Vlad's father, and Dracula simply meant his son, to later generations it became a standalone identity. No one remembered Vlad II Dracul as clearly. The word Dracula belonged to Vlad the Impaler alone, and through him, to something larger. This evolution was not accidental. Vlad himself seems to have embraced the power of the name. He signed some documents as Dracula, leaning into the identity that made his enemies tremble. In an age when rulers understood the value of symbols, coats of arms, seals, banners, Vlad recognized that his name was itself a weapon. If people already feared the devil, why not let them think he was the devil's son? Fear was currency, and he was willing to spend it lavishly. Yet it is crucial to see how the meanings overlapped. In one sense, Dracula was noble, the heir of a dragon knight sworn to defend Christendom. In another, it was demonic, the child of Satan himself. This duality reflected the man's dual reputation. In Wallachia, some saw him as a stern ruler who defended his land against the Ottomans. In Saxon towns, he was a tyrant who butchered innocents. The name contained both truths at once, amplifying whichever story the teller wished to emphasize. The weight of language extended beyond Romania. In Latin, Draco still meant dragon. In German, Dracula carried echoes of darkness. By the 16th century, the word Dracula was no longer confined to Wallachia, but was known across Europe, its meaning colored by tales of horror. Even before vampires entered the picture, the syllables alone suggested something uncanny. Centuries later, when Bram Stoker began writing his novel in the 1892nd, he searched for a name to give his Transylvanian count. He had notes filled with drafts, Count Wampir among them, but when he came across the historical figure of Vlad III, he struck gold. The name Dracula carried everything he needed: exoticism, menace, history, and ambiguity. To a Victorian audience, it sounded ancient and dangerous, steeped in both fact and myth. Stoker may not have known the full history of Vlad's deeds, but the name alone was enough to anchor his character. Thus, the path was completed. A boy born the son of a dragon knight, named in a tongue that blurred dragon and devil, became centuries later the world's most famous vampire. But let us step back to the 15th century again, to the peasants huddled in villages under Vlad's rule. To them, the name was not Gothic fiction. It was immediate, palpable, tied to decrees, soldiers, and punishments. Imagine hearing that Dracula was coming to collect taxes or to punish rebellion. The word alone might chill the spine, for it carried not just authority but threat. To defy a prince named for the devil seemed a risk no one could take lightly. In this sense, Vlad's name operated as a kind of psychological warfare. Long before pamphlets and printers carried his legend abroad, the name itself worked within his land. It whispered fear at firesides, echoed in prayers, and lingered in children's lullabies turned to warnings: behave, or Dracula will come for you. It is telling that of all the princes and voivodes of Wallachia, few names survive widely in memory. Vladislav, Radu, Basarab, these names appear in chronicles but do not resonate globally. Dracula does. It outlived dynasties. It crossed languages. It fused with superstition. That endurance was no accident, but the result of how language, fear, and storytelling intertwine. The name itself became a seed from which legends sprouted. Later, vampire lore in Eastern Europe about the Strigoi and Upir did not originally belong to Vlad. These were older, deeper folk beliefs. But when chroniclers needed a figure to embody such fears, the name was ready. Dracula, the devil's son, the impaler of thousands, fit neatly into the role of blood drinker and restless revenant. History bent toward myth, and myth latched onto history until the two were inseparable. Thus, the name Dracula is more than genealogy. It is a mirror. To some, it reflected a defender of Christendom, the son of a dragon sworn to resist the Ottomans. To others, it reflected a devil in human skin, a tyrant who delighted in cruelty. To later generations, it became a window into supernatural horror, the archetype of the vampire. Each era remade the name according to its fears. When we speak it now, in whispers before sleep or in the glow of cinema screens, we are speaking not only of a prince who lived 500 years ago, but of centuries of layered meaning. The dragon, the devil, the impaler, the vampire, all fused into one word, Dracula. And so, the name that began in 1431 as a byline to a family order grew into a legend greater than its bearer. Vlad III may have died in 1476, his body lost to time, but his name did not. It endured, carrying terror across borders, across centuries, until it became more immortal than any man could ever hope or dread to be. By the middle of the 15th century, the shadow of the Ottoman Empire had grown so vast that it seemed to blot out the horizon. For Wallachia, pressed against the Danube like a narrow shield, the threat was not distant rumour, but an ever-present reality. Armies marched north in endless waves, raiding, burning, demanding tribute. Princes were forced into uneasy bargains, paying gold and sons alike to forestall destruction. Yet Vlad III, who had returned to power hardened by exile and captivity, was not content to bend. His war with the Ottomans would become the crucible of his reign, and the source of the deeds that would carry his name far beyond his own time. The year was 1462. Vlad had already spent several years consolidating his authority in Wallachia, crushing boyar rebellions and terrorizing enemies into obedience. Now, with his realm steadier under his iron hand, he turned his gaze southward. The Ottomans, under Sultan Mehmed II, the same Mehmed who had taken Constantinople in 1453, pressed him for heavier tribute and recognition of Ottoman suzerainty. To pay was humiliation. To refuse was war. Vlad, recalling his years as a hostage, his hatred for the empire that had once chained him, chose war. But first, he prepared. Wallachia was small, its forces limited. To face the Ottomans in open battle was folly. Instead, Vlad sharpened the weapons he knew best: cunning, brutality, and fear. He strengthened fortresses along the Danube, summoned peasant levies, and sent word to Hungarian allies for support. Yet he trusted no one fully. He understood that alliances could crumble in an instant, but terror, once planted, grew deep roots. In the winter of 1461-1462, Vlad launched a preemptive strike. His forces crossed the Danube into Ottoman territory, raiding villages, burning towns, and slaughtering thousands. This was not a mere raid for plunder. It was a calculated message. Vlad's chronicles boast that he killed over 20,000 Ottomans in this campaign. Whether the number was exaggerated or not, the devastation was real. His men destroyed supplies, poisoned wells, and spread chaos across the frontier. The Sultan's governors reported villages emptied, fields scorched, and corpses left impaled as grisly milestones. One episode stands out. Vlad reportedly disguised his men as Ottoman soldiers, complete with turbans and banners, and infiltrated enemy territory. Under this guise, they gained access to fortified positions before turning on their hosts, slaughtering them in the night. This trickery, brutal and theatrical, left Mehmed enraged. A minor prince had humiliated his empire. Retaliation was inevitable. By spring, Mehmed gathered a massive army. Estimates range from 60,000 to 100,000 men, though numbers in chronicles are always suspect. What is certain is that the force dwarfed anything Vlad could field. Alongside soldiers marched engineers, siege weapons, and janissaries, the elite core of the Ottoman army. With this host, Mehmed intended not merely to punish, but to replace Vlad with his brother Radu, who had remained loyal to the Ottoman cause. Vlad, however, would not yield easily. He turned Wallachia into a wasteland ahead of the advancing army. Crops were burned, villages abandoned, wells poisoned, livestock driven into forests. His strategy was one of denial: starve the enemy, harry them, and sap their morale. To the Ottomans, advancing through Wallachia was like marching into a nightmare. At every turn, they found corpses, ruined fields, and silence where villages had once bustled. Then came the night of the 17th of June, 1462. The Ottoman army had encamped near Târgoviște, weary from its march. Under the cover of darkness, Vlad led a daring raid. With a picked force of cavalry, he infiltrated the enemy camp, aiming to kill Mehmed himself. The attack was sudden and ferocious. Fires lit the night, shouts rose, confusion spread. Ottoman soldiers, roused from sleep, struck at shadows and each other. In the chaos, thousands were slain. Vlad himself cut deep into the camp, coming close to the Sultan's tent before retreating. The attempt to assassinate Mehmed failed, but the raid became legend. Chronicles describe the Ottoman camp as a vision of hell flames, screams, and the relentless cry of Wallachian horsemen cutting through the dark. This raid, often called the night attack at Târgoviște, cemented Vlad's reputation as a master of terror warfare. It showed his audacity, his willingness to risk everything in one strike, and his cunning in turning darkness into ally. To the Ottomans, it was a shock. To Wallachians, it was proof that their prince feared no empire. To later storytellers, it was another layer in the myth of Dracula. Yet even audacity could not forever hold back the tide. Mehmed pressed on, his army advancing deeper. And then, outside Târgoviște, they found a sight that would freeze even the most hardened soldier: the infamous forest of the Impaled. Here, Vlad had arrayed some 20,000 stakes, each bearing a corpse, Ottoman prisoners, local traitors, enemies of all sorts. The field stretched as far as the eye could see, a grotesque parody of a woodland, each trunk a human body. The stench was overwhelming, the vision horrific. Mehmed himself reportedly paused in grim astonishment. According to one account, he murmured that it was impossible to defeat a man who could do such things. The effect was psychological. Though the Ottomans continued their campaign, their morale was shaken. Hunger, disease, and constant harassment by Vlad's forces further sapped their will. Eventually, Mehmed withdrew, leaving Radu with forces to continue the fight. Vlad had not destroyed the empire, but he had defied it, and in doing so, carved his legend into history. For the people of Wallachia, the cost was immense. Villages lay in ashes, fields ruined, thousands dead. War always falls hardest on peasants, and Vlad's scorched earth tactics spared none. Yet for Vlad, such sacrifice was necessary. To yield would have meant subjugation. To resist meant survival, at least for now. His reign after 1462, however, grew increasingly precarious. Radu, backed by Ottoman might, won support among boyars tired of Vlad's iron hand. By 1463, Vlad was forced into exile once more, first in Transylvania, then into Hungarian captivity. His war with the Ottomans had won him renown, but it had also exhausted his realm and enemies multiplied. Still, the night attack and the forest of the Impaled became the centerpiece of his legend. German pamphlets illustrated them with lurid woodcuts. Chroniclers across Europe repeated the tales with fascination and horror. To Western audiences, Vlad became the exemplar of Eastern cruelty, a prince who impaled thousands, raided in darkness, and faced empires without flinching. To Romanians, memories were divided. Some saw him as a national defender, others as a tyrant who bled his land dry. In either telling, the war with the Ottomans defined him. It was here that the boy who had once been a hostage faced his former captors as enemies. It was here that Dracula became not just a name, but a legend. The impalements, the scorched earth, the night raid all fused into an image of a man who ruled by terror and defied an empire. And it was here, in the summer of 1462, that the seeds were sown for the myths that would later merge with vampire lore. For when people centuries later whispered of Dracula, They did not recall treaties or laws. They remembered the forests of the impaled, the night attack, the prince who dared strike at the Sultan himself. History had recorded the war in blood and shadow, and in those records, legend grew. By the middle of the 15th century, a new force was reshaping how stories travelled across Europe, the printing press. Before this invention, tales spread mainly by word of mouth or through hand-copied manuscripts that were expensive and rare. But now, in the German towns of the Holy Roman Empire, presses clattered and churned out pamphlets, woodcuts, and broadsheets at a speed unimaginable only decades earlier. It was in this world of ink and paper that Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, found his reputation magnified, distorted, and immortalized. The deeds of impalement, of forests, of corpses, of raids and cruelties were already known among Wallachians and neighbouring peoples. But when German merchants in Transylvania clashed with Vlad over trade rights, their resentment took a sharper form. They controlled presses in cities such as Nuremberg and Bamberg, and through these machines they printed pamphlets describing Vlad as a monster. These were not neutral accounts, they were propaganda, designed to turn European opinion against him, to justify resistance to his policies, and to cast him as a villain beyond redemption. The woodcuts they produced were striking. One of the most famous shows Vlad seated at a table, calmly dining while around him victims writhe on stakes. Some are shown gasping in agony, others slumped lifeless. Servants bring him food, as if nothing is amiss. The message was chilling. Here was a ruler who not only killed, but feasted amid suffering. Whether he ever did so in reality hardly mattered. The image was so powerful it stamped itself into memory. Other pamphlets told stories in lurid prose. They claimed Vlad boiled people alive, cut off limbs, mutilated women, forced mothers to eat their children, and children to eat their parents. They described him as a butcher whose cruelty exceeded all known tyrants. The numbers given were enormous: 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 victims, figures impossible to verify but persuasive in their scale. To readers in the German states, these pamphlets confirmed what they already suspected, that the lands beyond Hungary were wild, cruel, and ruled by men barely human. The timing was significant. Europe was trembling under the Ottoman threat. Constantinople had fallen in 1453, shaking Christendom to its core. Rumours of Turkish cruelty, real and exaggerated, circulated widely. Into this atmosphere came tales of Vlad. To some, he was a defender who resisted the Ottomans with ferocity unmatched. To others, he was worse than the Turks themselves, a prince who used Christian cruelty to outmatch Muslim conquest. In either case, he was newsworthy, and the presses thrived on his legend. What made these pamphlets extraordinary was their reach. Cheaply produced, they could be sold in markets, taverns, and fairs. They were small enough to carry in a pocket, illustrated vividly enough to entertain even those who could not read. For the first time in European history, mass media turned a regional ruler into a continental figure of infamy. Vlad became, in effect, one of the first media monsters of Europe. His image was not carried only by rumour, but by paper, reproducible hundreds of times, spread across borders, and remembered long after his death. It is telling that most of these pamphlets came not from Wallachia itself, but from its neighbours and enemies. The Saxon merchants in Transylvania, angered by Vlad's restrictions and punishments, had every incentive to blacken his name. The Hungarian court, which vacillated between supporting and imprisoning him, found it convenient at times to portray him as unstable. Even the Ottomans, in their own chronicles, depicted him as a devil. Each side exaggerated, yet in their exaggerations they gave birth to something more enduring than fact, myth. The pamphlets also reveal the fascination of audiences with cruelty. In an age where executions were public spectacles and morality tales often carried gruesome detail, readers were drawn to stories of extreme punishment. To imagine a ruler who impaled entire villages, who dined among the dying, was horrifying, but it was also captivating. People bought these pamphlets not only to learn, but to shudder, to feel the thrill of fear at a safe remove. Vlad was not just a political figure, he was entertainment, a grim subject for conversation in marketplaces and at hearthsides. Some accounts softened their tone by portraying Vlad as just, if ruthless. They told of thieves punished harshly, of corruption crushed by terror. These stories, though still violent, painted him as a ruler who at least imposed order. Others, however, abandoned any balance and leaned fully into nightmare. In doing so, they helped transform Vlad from man into archetype. He was no longer merely a Prince of Wallachia. He was Dracula, a figure who embodied the very idea of cruelty. The power of these printed tales cannot be overstated. They shaped Western Europe's perception of Eastern Europe for centuries. To Germans, Austrians, and even Italians who read them, the lands beyond Hungary became synonymous with savagery and blood. Vlad's name became shorthand for cruelty, a reputation that lingered even when details were forgotten. Later writers, centuries removed, would still find his name ready at hand when seeking a symbol of darkness. It is remarkable, too, how closely these pamphlets anticipated later Gothic literature. The woodcut of Vlad dining among the impaled could almost be a scene from a macabre novel. The exaggerated numbers of victims prefigure the inflated horrors of penny dreadfuls. The mix of fascination and revulsion in readers was precisely the reaction that Gothic writers would later cultivate. In this sense, Vlad's pamphlets were not just propaganda, they were proto-horror, the first step in a cultural journey that would culminate in Dracula the vampire. Meanwhile, within Wallachia, these tales mattered less. Peasants judged Vlad not by pamphlets but by lived reality. Roads safer, taxes heavier, justice cruel but consistent. For them, the forests of impaled were not engravings but real horrors passed on in whispered stories. Yet even there, the pamphlets had an effect. Returning merchants and travellers carried copies, and soon Vlad's reputation was known even in lands he never touched. It is also worth noting that the printing press was still new. Johannes Gutenberg had only perfected movable type in the 1452nd. By the 1462nd and 1472nd, when Vlad's deeds were current, printers were eager for sensational content that would sell. The horrors of Dracula were perfect. In a sense, Vlad was among the first rulers to experience what we would now call a media frenzy. His image was curated, exaggerated, and distributed far beyond his control. He lived in Wallachia, but his legend lived across Europe. And so, long after he was driven from his throne, long after he died in battle in 1476, the pamphlets continued to circulate. They ensured that his name did not fade into the obscurity of regional politics, as so many princes did. Instead, it became larger than life, inked into the cultural memory of Europe. The forests of the impaled became legend not just because they happened, but because they were printed, illustrated, and read again and again. Thus, the pamphlets of terror were not mere propaganda sheets. They were the crucibles in which Vlad the Impaler was transformed into Dracula, the archetype of cruelty. They showed how technology and storytelling together could forge a reputation beyond death. And they remind us that history is never only what happened, it is also what was written, printed, and believed. In the quiet rhythm of tonight's telling, one can almost hear the presses clattering, the ink drying, the pamphlets stacked and sold in markets. Each sheet carried a fragment of Vlad's legend outward, like seeds scattered on the wind. Some took root in horror, some in fascination, but all grew into the mighty oak of myth. The man was gone, but the story endured. The life of Vlad III was steeped in violence, but it was his death that cemented his passage from history into legend. Few rulers have had their final days so clouded by uncertainty, their bodies so contested, or their graves so mythologized. In the hushed retellings of centuries, it was said that Vlad did not rest easily. Some whispered that he rose again, restless, as if even the earth itself could not contain him. By the mid-1472, Vlad's fortunes had risen and fallen more than once. His daring resistance against the Ottomans in 1462 had earned him both admiration and enmity. He had been imprisoned by the Hungarian king Matthias Corvinus for years, accused of cruelty and instability. During that time, pamphlets of terror multiplied, feeding on his absence, yet eventually he was released, once more seen as useful in the shifting chessboard of Balkan politics. In 1476, opportunity returned. With Hungarian support, Vlad launched a campaign to reclaim the Wallachian throne from his rivals. Once more, the land shook with marching armies and burning villages. Once more, peasants watched their fields trampled by men fighting for crowns far above their station. Vlad pressed forward with the same ferocity that had marked his earlier reigns. He was older now, but no less relentless. His enemies knew him not just as a contender, but as a spectre whose very name carried terror. Yet his third reign would be brief. In December 1476, Vlad's forces clashed with Ottoman-backed troops near Bucharest. The details of the battle are hazy accounts, differ on its scale and location, but the outcome was decisive. Vlad fell, cut down in the chaos. Some say he was slain by Ottoman soldiers. Others claim treachery among his own men, eager to be rid of the tyrant. In either telling, his end was violent, fitting for a life that had dealt so much death. What followed deepened the mystery. His head, according to several sources, was cut off and sent to Sultan Mehmed II in Constantinople, displayed on a stake as proof that the dreaded Dracula was no more. Imagine the Sultan gazing upon it, the face of the boy he had once known at Edirne, now lifeless, severed and mocked. For the Ottomans, it was triumph. For Vlad's enemies in Transylvania, it was relief. Yet for his people, the story did not end there. The body of Vlad was said to have been buried at the monastery of Snagov, north of Bucharest, an island monastery rising from the waters like a place deliberately chosen for seclusion. Monks there, in later centuries, would claim his grave rested beneath their church. Pilgrims and the curious came to see it, whispering prayers or curses over the stone. But when archaeologists investigated the site in the 20th century, they found the tomb empty, or at least not containing Vlad's remains. Other possible burial sites have been proposed at Comana, in another monastery. None has been verified. The uncertainty of his grave only fueled the legends. And then came the whispers that he did not rest. In a land thick with superstition, where Strigoi, the restless dead, were believed to rise from their graves, Vlad was a perfect candidate. People muttered that such a man, so steeped in cruelty, could not lie peacefully in the earth. His sins were too great, his blood-soaked deeds too heavy. Perhaps he walked again, seeking vengeance. Perhaps he haunted the forests he once filled with stakes. Perhaps his body was never found because it still moved. These rumours blended seamlessly with older folklore. In Romania, tales of the Strigoi had long warned of spirits or corpses rising to torment the living. In Slavic lands, the Upir drank blood, spreading plague and wasting sickness. Into these traditions, Vlad's story slipped like water into a vessel already shaped. The tyrant who had impaled thousands became, in death, a candidate for something worse, an undead lord, a revenant. His cruelty in life seemed proof that he might linger in unlife. The pamphlets that had circulated during his lifetime now gained posthumous power. Readers who had seen woodcuts of Vlad dining among the impaled now imagined him feasting still, not on meat, but on blood. Chronicles that described him as devilish seemed almost prophetic. The name Dracula, already tinged with the meaning of devil's son, now grew inseparable from the idea of a man who could not die, who fed on others, who stalked the night. Even in politics, his death did not bring closure. Wallachia remained contested, tossed between Ottoman influence and Hungarian ambition. His brother Radu had long been the Ottomans' puppet. Other princes rose and fell, but none carried the aura of Vlad. None inspired the same mixture of dread and fascination. In this way, his absence made him larger. Dead, he was more dangerous than alive, because his story was free to grow unchecked. Travellers passing through Wallachia in the 16th and 17th centuries recorded local tales about Vlad. Some remembered him as a just ruler, if cruel, who punished corruption and defended the land. Others described him as a demon. The truth hardly mattered anymore. The name alone was enough. Each telling added details, some drawn from folklore, others from imagination. The man became a ghost haunting his own country, a presence felt in silence, in ruins, in the shadow of monasteries. The absence of a known grave is particularly striking. Most rulers, even minor ones, had tombs that anchored their memory. Vlad did not. Or if he did, its location was forgotten or concealed. This absence became fertile ground for speculation. People asked, how could such a man be buried? Would the earth even take him? Was he walking still? These questions, asked in candlelit rooms, travelled across borders until they became part of the wider mythos of vampires. When Bram Stoker encountered the name Dracula centuries later, he knew little of these details. He had no proof of Vlad's missing body, no full grasp of the Strigoi tradition, but he sensed the resonance of the name, its power to evoke both dragon and devil. Unwittingly, he tapped into a wellspring of rumours that had been flowing for generations. His vampire count, though fictional, echoed the whispers that Vlad's death had never been complete, that his rest had never been peaceful. In this way, the uncertainty of Vlad's end was not a historical footnote, but a cornerstone of his legend. Had his body been buried, marked, and remembered, he might have faded like so many princes. Instead, the lack of closure kept his story alive. Every empty tomb, every whisper of a man who could not die, added to the aura. In the forests of Romania, in the taverns of Germany, in the salons of Paris, the tale was told: Vlad the Impaler, Dracula, had died. But his death was not the end. And so, the man who had terrified in life continued to terrify in death. His head may have adorned a stake in Constantinople, but his name adorned pamphlets, stories, and rumours across Europe. His grave may have been empty, but his legend was full, bursting with blood and shadow. His body may have rotted, but his reputation did not. It lived on, restless, like the Strigoi he came to resemble. Death, for most, is silence. For Vlad, it was another stage. In silence, his myth grew louder. In the earth, his absence made him more present. His death did not end the story, it began a new chapter, one that would stretch into centuries, until a Victorian writer gave the whispers form in a novel that carried his name into eternity. Long before the name Dracula was whispered in European courts, long before German pamphlets printed lurid tales of impalements, the villages of Romania already trembled at another word: Strigoi. These were not princes or noble. They were the restless dead, the cursed spirits, the ones who slipped from graves to trouble the living. To understand how Vlad III's death bled into vampire legend, one must first walk into the world of the Strigoi, where fear of the grave was as common as bread, and where the night was never empty. The Romanian countryside of the 15th century was a land of deep forests, misty valleys, and isolated hamlets, where Christian belief and ancient superstition coexisted uneasily. Life was fragile. Disease, famine, and war struck suddenly. Explanations for misfortune often reached not for science, but for spirits. Among these, none inspired more dread than the Strigoi. The word itself has roots in Latin striga, meaning witch, and in Slavic terms for restless spirits. In Romanian folklore, the Strigoi were the dead who could not find peace. Some were said to be souls of the wicked. Others were victims of untimely or violent deaths. Still, others were ordinary villagers whose burials had not been performed properly. Whatever their origin, they shared one trait: they returned. Strigoi could rise from their graves at night, slip through doors, and torment the living. They were said to drink blood, to drain life force, to sicken livestock, to spoil harvests. In some stories, they appeared as pale, shadowy figures. In others, they were more corporeal, their bodies swollen and ruddy from feeding. The fear was so ingrained that every village had rituals to guard against them. One common practice was to place a stake through the corpse's chest before burial. The stake, often made of oak or ash, was meant to pin the body to the earth, preventing it from rising. In other cases, the body was buried face down, so that if it tried to dig upward, it would only dig deeper into the ground. Some families placed heavy stones on the grave, others drove nails through the skull or planted thorns in the coffin. All these practices reveal the same truth: the dead were not trusted. The appearance of disease often reignited these fears. When tuberculosis struck a village, leaving its victims pale, thin, and coughing blood, people whispered that a strigoi was feeding. When cattle died suddenly, it was said a strigoi had slipped into the barn at night. When a child wasted away, villagers wondered which grave had given up its restless occupant. The response was often direct: exhume the suspected corpse, look for signs of unnatural freshness, and, if found, destroy it. Accounts survive of such rituals well into the 18th and 19th centuries. In some cases, villagers exhumed bodies, cut out their hearts, burned them, and mixed the ashes into water for the afflicted to drink. It was grim medicine, but in their eyes, necessary. The strigoi were not abstract fears. They were part of daily life, explanations for real suffering, enemies to be fought with wood, fire, and prayer. The connection between Vlad III and the strigoi was almost inevitable. A prince whose cruelty was legendary, whose body was lost or contested, whose death was uncertain, fit perfectly into this folklore. If ordinary peasants could return from the grave, how much more likely a man who had feasted among impaled corpses, whose name meant devil's son, whose grave was empty. To villagers, the step from tyrant to strigoi required little imagination. Indeed, some later accounts explicitly link Vlad with the strigoi. Stories circulated that he did not stay buried, that he walked again. These were not tales invented in Victorian London. They were whispered in Romanian villages long before Bram Stoker put pen to paper. Vlad's cruelty made him the perfect candidate, and the folk memory of his reign merged with the older, deeper fear of restless dead. The rituals to guard against strigoi also echo eerily with later vampire lore. Garlic was placed at windows and doors, for its pungent smell was thought to repel the undead. Holy water was sprinkled, crucifixes hung, wolves, sacred animals in Romanian lore, were believed able to sense and repel strigoi. Even mirrors came into play, as it was said that strigoi cast no reflection. All of these details would later find their way into the literature of vampires, woven seamlessly into Gothic novels. But they began not in fiction, but in folklore, in the simple, desperate acts of villagers trying to guard their homes from unseen threats. Night in these villages was heavy with silence, broken by the howl of wolves or the creak of branches. In such an atmosphere, it was easy to believe the dead walked. Peasants told stories around fires of neighbours who returned after burial, of footsteps heard outside windows, of shadows that moved when no one was there. These stories, retold generation after generation, shaped the culture of fear that surrounded the strigoi. In some traditions, strigoi were not only revenants but shapeshifters. They could take the form of animals, cats, dogs, even insects to slip unnoticed into homes. They could seduce the living, appearing as beautiful strangers only to drain their life. This blending of the ghostly and the corporeal the seductive and the terrifying, enriched the lore. Again, it is striking how these elements anticipate later vampire tales. The Strigoi as both monster and tempter, both shadow and flesh. It is important to remember that for Romanians of the medieval and early modern eras, these were not stories in the way we think of them. They were lived belief. Villages really dug up bodies. Families really burned hearts. Garlic really hung on doorways. The Strigoi were not metaphors, they were explanations, causes, threats as real as wolves or raiders. Vlad III's association with them was a natural fusion of history and superstition. His missing grave, his cruel life, his devilish name all aligned with the template of the Strigoi. He became, in memory, not only a tyrant but an undead tyrant. The terror of the Strigoi gave his legend new depth, transforming political cruelty into supernatural horror. When Bram Stoker eventually shaped his Dracula, he borrowed heavily from Victorian interpretations of Eastern European superstition. Yet the seeds lay in these villages, in these whispered tales, in the garlic and steaks and burned hearts. The Strigoi were the ancestors of the vampire myth. Vlad was their adopted son. Together, they formed a figure who was both historical and mythical, both man and nightmare. And so, to understand Dracula, one must understand the Strigoi. They were the fertile soil into which his legend was planted, the folk dread that nourished his name. Even now, in rural Romania, stories of Strigoi persist, proof that some fears never die. The peasants who first whispered them centuries ago would not be surprised. After all, the Strigoi are not supposed to rest. If Romania's Strigoi were the restless dead that stalked villages by night, then in the vast territories of the Slavs from Poland and Ukraine to Russia and beyond there lived an older, equally frightening figure, the upir. This word, echoing across languages and centuries, is one of the earliest known roots of the modern word vampire. To wander into the folklore of the upir is to enter a landscape where graves were never entirely trustworthy, where superstition blended with survival, and where the fear of the dead was as constant as the turning of seasons. The earliest mention of the upir appears as far back as the 11th century. Chronicles in Kievan Rus, the loose federation of Slavic principalities, describe rituals performed to ward off an upir, a revenant who could rise from death to feast upon the living. The word itself has many spellings, upir, upir, upior, but its essence remained the same. It was a creature of hunger, of corruption, of the grave refusing to let go. Unlike the Western European ghosts, who were often seen as intangible spirits, the upir was stubbornly physical. It rose in its body, bloated, blood-swollen, lips red, nails grown long and claw-like. Villagers who dug up suspected graves reported corpses unnaturally preserved, faces ruddy with what looked like fresh blood, and stomachs distended as though from feasting. Science now explains this decomposition, gases, blood pooling, and natural preservation in cold soil, but to a medieval villager, these were signs of feeding. A dead man who looked alive was a dead man who had not stayed dead. The Slavs believed that many different fates could turn an ordinary person into an upir, dying violently, especially without last rites, being excommunicated or cursed, being born under an unlucky star, or with certain physical marks, a caul on the head, red hair, a deformity. Even animals could play a role. A corpse stepped over by a cat or dog might rise as an upir. In a world where every shadow carried meaning, such superstitions gave form to the unpredictable cruelties of life. The damage caused by an upir was wide-ranging. It could sneak into homes at night and drink the blood of sleepers. It could attack cattle and drain their strength. It could spread disease plagues of wasting sickness, unexplained deaths. Sudden epidemics were often attributed to one. Entire families might be said to suffer under the predation of a single upir ancestor. When misfortune struck a village repeatedly, suspicion fell on the graveyard. The response was grim, but practical. Suspected corpses were exhumed. If the body appeared too fresh, too ruddy, too whole, villagers took action. Stakes were driven through the chest, pinning the corpse to the earth. Sometimes the head was cut off and buried separately. Sometimes the mouth was stuffed with stones or bricks to prevent the corpse from biting. In Poland, the anti-vampire burials that archaeologists have unearthed show skeletons with sickles laid across their necks. If the body rose, the blade would sever its head. These rituals were not symbolic. They were meant to prevent what was seen as a literal threat. These practices spread across the Slavic world. In Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, stories of the upper filled oral tradition. In Poland, the upior became the subject of songs and warnings. Each region gave the figure its own twists, but the core was constant. The dead could rise, and they hungered. Children grew up with the warning that the graveyard was not silent. Adults knew that when sickness swept through a village, it was not always God's will, it might be the work of a revenant neighbour. What tied all these fears together was the sense that the boundary between life and death was porous. Christian teaching promised resurrection, but in daily life, resurrection was feared, not hoped for. Priests blessed graves, but villagers still used thorns, garlic, and iron to reinforce the barrier. Faith coexisted uneasily with superstition. The Church condemned many of these practices, calling them pagan survivals. Yet when sickness came, it was the folk remedies that villagers turned to. The imagery of the upir foreshadows many traits that would later define the vampire in literature. The drinking of blood, the bloated, red-lipped corpse, the nocturnal visits, the spread of disease. Even the methods of destruction, staking, decapitation, burning are recognizable today as vampire-slaying techniques. What Bram Stoker presented as Gothic invention was already centuries old in Slavic soil. The upir also had a strange duality. In some tales, it was purely monstrous, a corpse without mind, only hunger. In others, it retained aspects of personality, even rising in daylight to mingle with villagers before returning to its grave at night. This unsettling overlap between human and monster, between neighbour and predator, gave the folklore its enduring unease. Anyone could be an upir after death. Anyone could return. It is easy to see how Vlad III's story, when told beyond Wallachia, absorbed the aura of the upir. German pamphlets called him a devil. Slavic chronicles described his cruelties. But among villagers, the idea that he might return as a blood drinker was not a stretch. He had already spilled so much blood in life. Why should death stop him? A cruel prince with an uncertain grave was the perfect candidate to merge with the older fear of the upir. The blending of Vlad and the upir was not immediate, but gradual. Stories of his impalements circulated in the same lands where villagers whispered of revenants. Over time, the two streams converged. The cruelty of a historical ruler, the superstition of restless corpses together, they formed the template of Dracula. The vampire count of later centuries owes as much to Slavic upir as to any one Wallachian prince. Archaeology continues to uncover evidence of these fears. Graves from Poland, dating to the 17th century, reveal skeletons with sickles across their throats, or heavy stones pressed into their mouths. In Bulgaria, bodies have been found with iron rods driven through their chests. These are not fictional embellishments, they are physical proof that entire communities believed in and actively defended themselves against. The upir, each grave is a frozen echo of fear, a reminder that the vampire was real not in flesh, but in the minds of those who buried their dead with such precautions. Imagine the stillness of a Slavic night, centuries ago. A village sleeps, but one family wakes, huddled around a fire, convinced that their sick child is being drained by an unseen hand. Tomorrow, they will dig up the grave of a neighbour, convinced he is the culprit. They will cut him open, burn him, scatter his ashes. For them, this is not cruelty, it is defence, it is survival. In such a world, the Upir was not a legend but a neighbour, a threat as real as wolves in the forest. This, then, is the soil from which vampire myths grew. The Strigoi of Romania, the Upir of the Slavs, these were not stories invented for novels. They were lived fears, woven into daily rituals, shaping how people buried their dead and how they explained misfortune. Vlad III's reputation, when it spread into these lands, found fertile ground to take root. He was already feared. To imagine him as an Upir was only natural, and so the Upir stands as one of the oldest ancestors of the vampire myth. Its blood runs through every later telling, from penny dreadfuls to modern films. And in its shadow, the figure of Vlad the Impaler became something more than a prince, more than a tyrant. He became a symbol, fusing with folklore into an immortal terror. By the early 18th century, long after Vlad III had perished and the Ottoman Empire had expanded deeper into Europe, whispers of the restless dead still haunted villages across the Balkans. Yet it was in Serbia that these whispers became shouts, where belief turned into full-blown hysteria, and where the word vampire first entered the vocabulary of Western Europe. The Serbian vampire panic of the 1722nd and 1732nd remains one of the most remarkable episodes in the history of folklore. Not because vampires suddenly appeared, but because villagers, priests, and even imperial officials all convinced themselves that the dead had risen. The story begins with a man named Arnold Pauli, a former soldier who lived in the village of Medvedja, sometimes recorded as Medvedja, in what was then Habsburg-controlled Serbia. Pauli, according to accounts, had once fought against the Ottomans and claimed to have been attacked by a vampire during his campaigns in Ottoman lands. To protect himself, he said he had eaten earth from the vampire's grave and smeared himself with its blood, a ritual thought to ward off the curse. But Pauli later returned to his village, married, and lived quietly until his death in 1726, after falling from a cart and breaking his neck. Soon after Pauli's burial, strange events began. Villagers reported seeing him at night, walking through the settlement. People claimed he attacked them, leaving them weak and pale. Livestock died mysteriously. Then, several villagers fell ill and died in rapid succession. Fear swept through Medvedja. Convinced Pauli had risen as a vampire, the community exhumed his body. What they found convinced them further. The corpse was unnaturally preserved, its skin ruddy, its mouth stained as if with blood. To them, this was proof. The response was swift and grim. The villagers drove a stake through Pauli's heart. According to witnesses, he groaned and bled a sign. They thought that the vampire was destroyed. His body was then burned, and his ashes scattered. But fear lingered. To be safe, the villagers exhumed several of Pauli's supposed victims, who were also found unnaturally preserved. These too were staked, burned, and disposed of. For the time being, calm returned to Medvedja. But the panic did not end. A few years later, in the 1732nd, new outbreaks occurred in the same region. More villagers fell ill, more deaths occurred, and once again suspicion fell upon the dead. The graves of suspected vampires were opened, and once again the bodies were found seemingly intact. This time, the hysteria drew the attention of the Austrian authorities. Serbia, being under Habsburg rule at the time, was of interest to imperial officials who wanted to understand and contain the unrest. Military surgeons and administrators were dispatched to investigate. The reports they filed are extraordinary documents, official, bureaucratic, yet filled with the language of superstition. They describe corpses swollen with blood, bodies fresh despite weeks in the ground, hearts engorged and bleeding when pierced. The officials, many of them trained in medicine by the standards of the day, nonetheless concluded that vampires were real and dangerous. The word vampire, derived from the Slavic upir, appeared in these reports and quickly entered Western European languages through translations. For the first time, the vampire was not only folklore but an international news item. Pamphlets and newspapers carried the stories across Europe. In Leipzig, Hamburg, and Paris, readers devoured the strange reports from Serbia. Learned men debated the phenomenon. Theologians speculated on whether vampires were demons, witches, or damned souls. Physicians argued about natural explanations, citing decomposition processes, disease, or imagination. Yet the vampire panic proved difficult to dismiss, for the reports bore the seal of imperial officials. These were not peasants whispering by candlelight, but officers and doctors describing what they had seen with their own eyes. The panic in Serbia illustrates how deeply ingrained belief in the undead was, even in an age of enlightenment. Rationalism and science were rising in Europe, yet here was an empire publishing documents about blood-drinking corpses. The contradiction fascinated and horrified readers. It suggested that beneath the veneer of progress, the old fears still throbbed, raw and powerful. For the villagers themselves, of course, the matter was not abstract. Illness and death stalked their homes, livestock wasted, neighbours weakened. In their eyes, vampires were not metaphors or philosophical puzzles, they were culprits to be confronted. The rituals staking, burning, decapitation were not symbolic but urgent. Better to desecrate a corpse than to risk the spread of the curse. The details of the Serbian vampire cases also show how folklore adapted to circumstance. In times of war, displacement, and disease, communities sought explanations for suffering. Vampires provided a clear cause and a way to act. If disease spread, it was not unseen germs but a restless dead neighbour. If livestock died, it was not poor fodder but a vampire's feeding. By naming the threat, they felt empowered to fight it. The rituals gave them control in a world where control was scarce. The figure of Arnold Pauli loomed especially large. His story was retold endlessly, a soldier cursed by vampires, who in turn became one. His exhumation, his staking, his burning became set pieces in the growing European imagination. Paule was no longer only a villager in Serbia. He was a character in the unfolding mythology of the vampire. His name, though sometimes misspelled or distorted, appeared in newspapers and essays across the continent. He became a forerunner of Count Dracula, a flesh and blood man turned legend. The Serbian panic also helped shape the imagery of the vampire in Western Europe. The blood-filled corpse, the nocturnal visits, the destruction by stake and fire, all of these entered the canon. Writers, artists and scholars absorbed these details, blending them with older Slavic and Romanian lore, until the figure of the vampire became standardized. By the end of the 18th century, when Gothic literature blossomed, the vampire was already familiar to readers, thanks largely to the sensational stories from Serbia. It is worth pausing to imagine what it felt like in those Serbian villages during the panic. Picture a winter night in Medvedja. The air is cold, the ground frozen. A group of villagers, clutching torches, gather in the churchyard. Fear has driven them from their homes, fear of illness, fear of shadows at the window, fear of the pale faces of neighbours who died too soon. The priest murmurs prayers. The men dig into the earth, their shovels clanging against frozen soil. At last they reach the coffin. They open it, and in the flickering torchlight they see the body ruddy, bloated, eyes half open, gasps rise. Someone thrusts a stake into the chest. A cry, perhaps from escaping gases, escapes the corpse. Blood wells. The villagers recoil, then push forward, burning the remains. Only then, in the rising smoke, do they feel relief. Only then do they believe the danger is ended. Such scenes, repeated across years, gave the panic its force. These events are not inventions of novels. They were recorded by military surgeons like Johannes Flückiger, whose 1,732 report described the exhumations in clinical detail. His words, dry and precise, were nonetheless chilling. Corpses undecayed, blood flowing from wounds, organs fresh. For Enlightenment Europe, which prided itself on reason, these documents were a paradox science confirming superstition. The impact of the Serbian vampire panic cannot be overstated. It carried the vampire from local superstition into global culture. The word itself, vampire, entered French, German, and English through these reports. Without Serbia, there might have been no Dracula, no Gothic vampire tradition, no modern myth. The villagers of Medvegia, digging in frozen ground by torchlight, unknowingly planted the seed of a legend that would one day stalk literature, theatre, and film. And in this way, the panic links back to Vlad III. Though separated by centuries, both Vlad and the Serbian vampires fed the same growing mythos. Vlad's cruelty, spread by pamphlets, made him a devilish figure. The Serbian exhumations, spread by reports, made vampires seem real. When the two streams met in the imagination of Bram Stoker, the result was Count Dracula, half prince, half revenant, a fusion of history and superstition. The panic also shows us something deeper about human nature. In times of fear, when death strikes suddenly and explanations are scarce, people turn to stories. They dig into graves, not because they are irrational, but because they seek control. The vampire, whether Strigoi, Upir, or Serbian revenant, is a way of naming the unknown. It is the face we give to our helplessness. Vlad understood this instinct and wielded it as terror. The villagers of Medvegia understood it and wielded it as defense. Both fed the same eternal story. The forests of Eastern Europe are thick with legends, but few names echo as chillingly as that of Elizabeth Bathory, remembered in whispers as the Blood Countess. If Vlad III, Dracula, embodied cruelty on the battlefield, then Bathory became the archetype of bloodlust in the halls of nobility. Her story, born of rumour and accusation in the early 17th century, would come to rival Dracula's in its capacity to horrify. And though centuries separate their lives, the Countess's legend bled seamlessly into the same cultural vein tales of rulers who craved blood, of nobles who fed upon the innocent, of the thin line between history and myth. Elizabeth was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families of Hungary. The Bathorys were wealthy, well-connected, and steeped in politics. They ruled vast estates, commanded armies, and intermarried with royalty. Elizabeth grew up amid privilege, educated in languages, law, and courtly manners, a rarity for women of her time. Yet even in childhood, whispers clung to her. Tales suggest she suffered seizures, that she displayed a temper sharper than her tutors could manage, that she was already marked by something volatile within. Whether these stories are truth or invention, they form the first brushstrokes of the portrait that later chroniclers painted in blood. At the age of 15, Elizabeth married Count Ferenc Nardesti, a nobleman renowned as the Black Knight of Hungary for his campaigns against the Ottomans. Their marriage was a union of power and influence, cementing the Bathory-Nardesti dynasty as one of the most formidable in the region. While her husband fought at the frontiers, Elizabeth managed their estates, presiding over castles such as Chachtis in present-day Slovakia. It was here, within cold stone walls and shadowed corridors, that her legend would take root. The accusations began innocuously. Servants whispered of cruelty, of punishments meted out with unusual ferocity. Some claimed Elizabeth beat her maids for minor offences, pricked them with needles, or forced them into freezing conditions. Others said she delighted in inventing torments, using iron instruments or heated tools. In a world where nobles wielded unchecked power over their households, cruelty was not unusual, but Elizabeth's alleged acts were said to go beyond cruelty into obsession. The darkest tales claim that Elizabeth's violence became ritualized. According to later testimony, she struck a servant one day so hard that blood spattered onto her hand. Wiping it away, she imagined her skin appeared younger, smoother. From that moment, so the legend goes, she pursued blood not merely as punishment, but as cosmetic. She bathed in it, smeared it upon herself, drank it, believing it held the secret to eternal youth. Servants disappeared. Peasants' daughters were lured to the castle with promises of work, only to vanish behind its gates. Elizabeth, in these stories, transformed from noblewoman to predator. By the early 1602, rumours had grown so persistent that they reached the ears of the king. In 1610, an investigation was launched. Hungarian authorities sent Count György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, to Csárdás. What he claimed to find shocked Europe. Dozens of witnesses testified against the countess. Servants, villagers, even minor nobles spoke of bodies buried in shallow graves, of girls found mutilated, of chambers echoing with screams. Numbers ballooned in the telling. Some said she had killed dozens, others hundreds, others more than 600 young women. Thurzó himself reported walking into the castle to find a dying girl and another already dead. Elizabeth was arrested, though as a noblewoman she was never formally tried. Instead, her accomplices' servants who allegedly helped procure victims were executed. Elizabeth herself was confined within Csárdás castle, sealed in her chambers, windows bricked up, doors barred, food passed through small openings. There she remained until her death in 1614. When guards entered her chamber one morning, they found her lifeless, the Blood Countess finally stilled. The legend, however, did not still. It grew. Pamphlets and chronicles spread the tales, describing Elizabeth as the most prolific female murderer in history. She became a figure of fascination, a noblewoman whose cruelty rivaled any tyrant's, a woman who had transformed vanity into atrocity, and at the heart of her legend lay blood. The image of Elizabeth bathing in the blood of virgins became the centerpiece of her myth. Though historians now debate whether this ever happened, many suspect it was political propaganda to discredit her and seize her lands. The image endured because it struck at primal fears. Blood is life. To waste it, to feast upon it, to bathe in it, is to transgress the most sacred boundary. In Christian belief, blood is tied to sacrifice, to the Eucharist, to redemption. For Elizabeth to immerse herself in it not as holy symbol but as cosmetic vanity turned her into an anti-Christ figure, a perversion of faith and morality. In folklore, her story merged easily with vampire traditions. Like the Strigoi and Upir, she was said to drink blood. Like Vlad Dracula, she was accused of cruelty that blurred into monstrosity. Her gender added a further twist. The vampire as seductress, the female predator who uses beauty to ensnare and destroy. In this way, Elizabeth became an early archetype of the femme fatale vampire, a figure that would flourish in later literature and film. Historians continue to debate the truth of her crimes. Some argue that Elizabeth was guilty, but exaggerated that she abused servants cruelly, but did not murder hundreds. Others suggest she was framed by political rivals eager to seize her fortune and lands, that witnesses were coerced, that stories grew in the telling. It is possible that the truth lies somewhere in between, tangled in the shadows of history. What matters more, however, is how her story was received and remembered. The Blood Countess became a legend not because of precise facts, but because her alleged deeds fit so perfectly into the existing tapestry of vampire lore. In later centuries, her story inspired countless retellings. Gothic writers seized upon her image as a noblewoman bathing in blood. Plays and novels cast her as both villain and tragic figure, torn by vanity. In the 20th century, she appeared in films and horror stories as a prototype of the vampire countess, forever young, forever thirsting. Her castle, Çarşısı, crumbled into ruins, yet became a site of dark tourism, pilgrims arriving to stand where the countess once reigned. Elizabeth Bathory's tale also reveals something about gender and fear. Male cruelty in history, such as Vlad's impalements, was often framed as political, strategic, or tyrannical. Female cruelty, however, was sexualized, tied to vanity, seduction, and unnatural appetite. Elizabeth was not only remembered as a killer, but as a corrupter of beauty, a woman whose desire for youth led her into monstrosity. This gendered lens shaped her legend, ensuring she would not be remembered as merely a cruel noblewoman, but as the embodiment of bloodlust. And so, the Blood Countess stands beside Vlad the Impaler in the pantheon of Europe's dark figures. One ruled by terror, the other by vanity. One impaled thousands, the other allegedly drained maidens. Both became larger than life, remembered not for governance or politics, but for cruelty so extreme it blurred into myth. Together, their stories merged into the bloodstream of vampire legend, enriching the figure that Bram Stoker would later draw upon. Tonight, in the meditative flow of this telling, we can imagine the silent corridors of Çarşısı Castle. The walls still stand, broken and overgrown, yet heavy with memory. Some say you can hear whispers in the night wind, the echo of screams, the drip of blood upon stone. Whether she bathed in blood or not, Elizabeth Bathory's legend ensures she never rests. Like Vlad, her cruelty lives beyond her death, transformed into story, into warning, into archetype. She is the Blood Countess, not merely a woman of history, but a vampire in memory. Disease has always haunted humanity, but in pre-modern Europe, plagues were not simply medical crises. They were supernatural mysteries, terrors with no visible cause. When a village wasted away, when families sickened one by one, when livestock died in their stalls, explanations were desperately sought. And in the folklore of Eastern Europe, one explanation rose again and again: vampires. The belief that the dead returned to drain the living did not only reflect superstition, it reflected the lived reality of epidemic disease. To understand this, one must picture the rhythms of a medieval or early modern village. Life was precarious, even in good years. Food supplies were fragile, winters harsh, medicine rudimentary. Then, suddenly, illness could strike. Tuberculosis, cholera, plague, rabies, each brought strange symptoms, each moved invisibly, leaving devastation. In such times, the dead did not stay buried in memory. They were blamed for continuing to feed. Take tuberculosis, known then as consumption. It wasted its victims slowly, leaving them pale, thin, and coughing blood. In a household, one family member would fall ill, then another, until it seemed the sickness passed from bed to bed. To villagers, it was not an unseen bacterium, but a dead relative returning, draining the life of kin. The first to die was often exhumed, accused of rising, and destroyed with stake or fire. Archaeological digs in New England, centuries later, revealed graves treated this way, skeletons rearranged, ribs broken, hearts removed. Though far from Eastern Europe, the same logic applied. Vampires caused the wasting sickness. Cholera, sweeping through in waves during the 18th and 19th centuries, left bodies desiccated, lips blue, skin grey. It struck suddenly, leaving the living bewildered at how quickly neighbours turned into corpses. In some Balkan villages, cholera outbreaks triggered vampire panics. People insisted that the dead had risen to spread the disease. Mass exhumations followed, bodies staked, burned, or mutilated in hopes of stopping the invisible tide. Rabies also played its part in shaping vampire lore. Carried by wolves, dogs, and bats, rabies transformed the infected into figures of terror. They grew sensitive to light and water, became restless at night, and often bit others in violent fits. To peasants who witnessed these changes, the line between disease and possession blurred. A man foaming at the mouth, attacking with teeth, avoiding sunlight. What else could he be but cursed? A kind of vampire even before death. The plague, of course, haunted Europe above all. Bubonic plague arrived in waves across centuries, killing millions. Whole villages were emptied, streets filled with corpses. In Italy, gravediggers sometimes found decomposing bodies in plague pits with blood seeping from mouths, bloated and dark. To observers, these looked like vampires feeding even in death. One account from Venice describes gravediggers stuffing bricks into corpses' mouths to stop them chewing on their shrouds. Modern science tells us this was simply decomposition gases forcing fluids out, but to the frightened, it was proof of the undead. These associations between disease and vampirism gave the myths longevity. Vampires explained not only isolated deaths, but epidemics. If one dead man could rise and feed, he could spread illness to many. The idea turned random sickness into a narrative. Someone was responsible. That someone was the restless dead. Communities that could not stop the plague with prayers or medicine could at least dig up graves, confront the accused, and perform rituals of destruction. It gave them action in the face of helplessness. Rituals varied. In some regions, the heart was cut out and burned. In others, the head was severed and placed between the corpse's legs. Ashes of burned hearts were sometimes mixed with water and drunk by survivors as a cure. Garlic was stuffed into mouths, iron rods hammered into skulls, heavy stones placed on chests. Archaeology across Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania has unearthed such burials, proof that these were not isolated stories but widespread practices. The link between disease and vampires also shaped how outsiders saw Eastern Europe. Western travelers, hearing of such rituals, described them with both fascination and contempt. To Enlightenment thinkers, peasants who exhumed bodies seemed backward, trapped in superstition, yet those same thinkers lived in cities racked by plague, unable to stop it themselves. The vampire became a symbol of both fear and ridicule, a way to explain suffering but also a mark of primitive belief. What makes the connection even stronger is that symptoms of disease often mirrored vampire attacks. Victims grew pale, weak, listless, and wasted. Their sleep was disturbed, their nights restless. In families struck by tuberculosis, survivors often reported feeling drained, as though life was being stolen. The metaphor of vampirism was natural. Where science had no answers, folklore filled the void. In some cases, plagues even shifted vampire lore itself. During cholera outbreaks, for example, villagers began to associate vampires not only with blood drinking but with spreading pestilence. Vampires were said to crawl into houses and breathe sickness onto sleepers. In these tales, they became not just predators of individuals but harbingers of epidemic. This evolution shows how flexible folklore is, always adapting to explain the newest horrors. Vlad III's legend merged with these beliefs because of timing and reputation. His cruelty, his impalements, his missing grave, all these already aligned him with fears of restless dead. Add to this the recurring plagues in Eastern Europe, and it was easy to imagine that a figure like Dracula did not simply kill in life, but returned to spread disease after death. His cruelty became contagious in memory. His name itself became a kind of plague. The Serbian vampire panics of the 18th century, which we traced earlier, were almost always triggered by outbreaks of illness. Villagers saw one death, then another, and sought a cause. Vampires offered that cause. Exhumations were the cure. And because the Austrian authorities recorded these events, the association between plague and vampire spread beyond the Balkans into the Western imagination. By the time Gothic writers sought inspiration, the idea of the vampire as both blood drinker and plague bearer was already entrenched. The symbolism of blood also deepened the connection. Disease often revealed itself through blood coughing it, bleeding unnaturally, Seeing it seep from corpses, blood was life, but it was also corruption. To lose blood was to lose vitality. To see blood where it should not be at the mouth of a corpse was to see vampirism. And so blood became the thread tying together disease, death, and the undead. It is telling that when Bram Stoker wrote Dracula in 1897, he set his vampire against the backdrop of Victorian fears of contagion. His count spreads corruption, drains life, and transmits his curse like an infection. The language of vampirism in the novel mirrors the language of disease. Bite marks are wounds of transmission. Victims waste away as though ill. Doctors debate cures. Stoker did not invent this imagery. He inherited it from centuries when plague and vampires were entwined. And so, in the quiet of our telling tonight, we see how plagues gave vampires their power. Without epidemics, the myths might have faded. But with each outbreak, with each unexplained death, the stories revived. They explained what medicine could not. They gave shape to invisible terrors. They offered actions, however grim, to frightened communities. And in doing so, they ensured that the vampire would never die, but would rise again and again, as restless as the corpses it described. In this way, vampires are as much about fear of disease as they are about fear of death. They are metaphors for contagion, for wasting, for the unseen enemy that passes silently from one body to another. When Vlad III was remembered as Dracula, when Elizabeth Bathory was called the Blood Countess, when Serbian villagers dug up Arnold Pauli, all were tied by this thread: blood, sickness, and the dread that what kills us is not gone but still among us. And so, in the hush of history, plagues gave birth to legends, and legends gave voice to the fears of plague. Vampires became our way of speaking about illness without naming it, of fighting what we could not see by imagining what we could. In that imagination, they thrived, immortal. For all the terror that vampires inspired, villagers and townsfolk were never entirely helpless. Across Eastern Europe, a deep well of faith and ritual stood ready to confront the restless dead. The vampire was not only a predator but also an enemy of God, and so it could be resisted with prayers, relics, and sacred symbols. Folklore, Christianity, and local custom intertwined, giving communities a toolkit of protection that ranged from the simple clove of garlic hung in a window to elaborate exhumations conducted with priest and shovel. To picture this struggle, imagine a village at dusk in 17th century Transylvania. The sun sinks, shadows lengthen, and families retreat indoors. Before shuttering the doors, a woman rubs garlic across the threshold. Children tuck sprigs of hawthorn beneath their pillows. A man traces the sign of the cross above the doorway. The church bell tolls across the valley, its echo meant to push back the darkness. The night is feared, but it is not unchallenged. Every act is a small fortress against the undead. Garlic was perhaps the most widespread defense. Its sharp, pungent odor was thought to repel evil. Cloves were hung in doorways, rubbed on window frames, worn on belts, or placed in the mouths of corpses suspected of vampirism. Garlic was cheap, common, and effective, not only in imagination but in practice. It preserved food, repelled insects, and carried natural medicinal properties. Its connection to health and vitality made it the perfect symbolic barrier against a creature that drained both. In villages across Romania, Serbia, and Poland, garlic was more than seasoning, it was salvation. Religious symbols offered another layer of defense. The cross, carried as a pendant or carved into doorways, was said to drive vampires away. Holy water, sprinkled across beds or graves, cleansed and sanctified. Priests were often summoned to bless homes, to chant prayers, to consecrate cemeteries where fears had risen. In Orthodox lands, icons of Christ, the Virgin Mary, or local saints were displayed prominently, their painted eyes believed to ward off evil. In Catholic regions, relics of martyrs, rosaries, and crucifixes served the same purpose. These objects reminded villagers that vampires were not merely physical threats, but spiritual ones, enemies of the divine order. Natural symbols also played their part. Hawthorn branches, thorns, and wild roses were used to encircle graves or protect doorways. Wolves were revered as guardians, their howls both feared and respected, for wolves were thought to sense and hunt the undead. Iron, too, was powerful. Nails driven into coffins, knives placed across corpses, horseshoes nailed above doors. Iron's strength was thought to bind spirits, anchoring them where they belonged. When prevention failed, communities turned to more drastic rituals. A suspected vampire's grave would be opened, often at night, with villagers gathered by torchlight. The priest might bless the sight, but it was the men of the village who wielded shovels and stakes. If the body inside was found fresh, bloated, or bloody at the mouth, the conclusion was obvious. The vampire was feeding. A sharpened stake oak, ash, or hawthorn was driven through the chest. In some regions, the head was severed and placed between the corpse's legs, or face down, so it could not rise. In others, the heart was cut out and burned. Ashes might be scattered or mixed into water to cure those believed to be afflicted. Each act was a mixture of medicine and faith, desperate attempts to protect the living from the dead. Such rituals were not carried out lightly. They were terrifying, grim, and often deeply divisive. Families wept to see their loved one desecrated, even if neighbors insisted it was necessary. Yet the fear of vampirism was greater than grief. Better to mutilate one corpse than lose an entire household. In this, the community acted as one, bound by the shared conviction that the dead could harm the living unless restrained. The church itself had an uneasy relationship with these practices. Official doctrine condemned many of them as superstition, remnants of pagan belief. Priests reminded their flocks that only God held power over life and death, that resurrection was a holy mystery, not a fearful curse. Yet in practice, clergy often tolerated or even participated in anti-vampire rites. They understood that faith had to meet people where they lived, and if exhumations calmed fears, then exhumations were allowed. In Orthodox lands especially, priests played central roles, blessing graves, chanting prayers, and guiding villagers in how to release the dead. Interestingly, vampire defenses often blended with seasonal rituals. At midsummer and midwinter, festivals marked the turning of the year. Fires were lit, herbs gathered, songs sung to drive away evil spirits. These were times when the boundary between worlds was thought to thin, when strigoi and upia were most active. Garlic was harvested, charms renewed, cemeteries blessed. Faith against the undead was not only reactive but cyclical, woven into the rhythm of the year. Travellers in the 18th and 19th centuries often marvelled at the seriousness with which these practices were carried out. Reports describe villagers in Wallachia refusing to sleep without garlic by their beds, or peasants in Serbia refusing to walk past a graveyard without making the sign of the cross. Foreigners sometimes scoffed, calling these people backward. Yet in truth, such faith gave them resilience. They were not helpless before disease or death. They had rituals, beliefs, and defenses that made the unknown at least manageable. Faith against the undead also reflected deeper truths about life and death in rural Europe. In a world where mortality was constant, where death came suddenly and often, people sought assurance that death was not chaos. If some dead rose in anger, then there must be ways to restrain them. Garlic, crosses, holy water, these were tools not only against vampires but against despair. They told people that the world was not without order, that God and ritual could still protect them. The persistence of these practices into modern times is remarkable. As late as the 19th century, villagers in Romania and Serbia still performed exhumations, still staked corpses, still sprinkled garlic in doorways, In some rural communities, the customs survived into the 20th century, long after science explained disease and decomposition. Even today, echoes remain. Garlic garlands are still sold at Romanian festivals. Stories of strigoi and upir are still told by elders to children. Faith against the undead has not died, only softened into tradition. The endurance of these rituals shows how deeply vampires touched the human imagination. They were not only stories of terror, but frameworks for action, ways to confront the unknown. Faith offered both protection and meaning. To hang garlic was to affirm life. To hold a crucifix was to assert the power of the divine over darkness. To drive a stake was to declare that the community would not yield to fear. It is here, in the convergence of faith and folklore, that we see the roots of modern vampire stories. When Stoker described crucifixes burning Dracula's flesh, when films showed garlic-repelling vampires, they were not inventing but preserving the old defences of peasants. The props of horror cinema were once the sacred tools of survival. And so, in the soft telling of tonight's history, we can imagine those villagers centuries ago frightened yet defiant, clutching crosses and cloves, trusting that their rituals held power. The vampire might rise, but it would not find them unguarded. Faith was their shield, ritual was their weapon, and in that faith they endured. By the early 18th century, the vampire was no longer just a whisper of Balkan villages or a shadow in Romanian folklore. Through the machinery of empire, print, and rumour, the word itself began to move westward, entering new languages, new imaginations, and new fears. What had once been a local belief tied to strigoi and upir became a European obsession, and the term vampire, with its sharp consonants and dark vowels, became a household word from Vienna to Paris, from London to Leipzig. The journey began, as we have seen, with the Serbian vampire panics of the 1722nd and 1732nd, when imperial officials of the Habsburg monarchy investigated reports of villagers exhuming corpses. They wrote their findings in formal reports. These were not folk tales told by peasants, but documents sealed with imperial authority. When Johannes Flukinger, an Austrian military surgeon, described in 1732 the exhumation of suspected vampires in Medvedja, his words carried weight. He spoke of corpses undecayed, of fresh blood found in mouths, of villagers convinced they were under attack, and crucially, he used the word vampire, adopting the Slavic term into German prose. Once printed, the word took on a life of its own. Newspapers across Europe seized on the reports. The Leipzig Neue Zeitungen von Gelehrten Sachen published summaries. The London Gentleman's Magazine reprinted translations. In Paris, intellectuals debated the reality of vampires in coffee houses. For the first time, the vampire was not confined to Slavic tongues, but entered French as vampire, German as vampire, English as vampire. The word itself seemed exotic, foreign, yet oddly familiar, carrying both menace and allure. The timing was perfect for fascination. Europe in the early 18th century was caught between Enlightenment rationalism and deep superstition. Philosophers like Voltaire mocked the idea of vampires, calling them absurd, relics of barbaric belief. Yet the very fact that such ridicule was necessary shows how popular the stories were. Learned men wrote essays on whether vampires were demons, revenants, or natural phenomena. Physicians debated decomposition, trying to explain why corpses might appear fresh. Priests weighed in on the spiritual dangers. In salons and universities alike, the vampire became a subject of conversation, serious and satirical alike. For common readers, the appeal was simpler. These were thrilling, terrifying stories. Newspapers and pamphlets described villagers staking corpses, blood spurting from wounds, entire communities consumed by fear. The Gothic images fired imaginations. In an age when sensationalism sold, the vampire was irresistible. By mid-century, the word had crossed into multiple languages, cementing itself in the lexicon of Europe. Interestingly, the vampire's westward journey reshaped its meaning. In Slavic lands, the vampire was a bloated corpse, a disease bringer, more grotesque than glamorous. But as Western writers took up the idea, they began to refine and reinterpret it. The vampire became more spectral, more aristocratic, more tied to themes of corruption and seduction. The rustic revenant of Balkan fields was transformed into a figure suited for salons and literature. This evolution shows how myths adapt to new cultural landscapes. One of the earliest literary treatments came in 1748, when Heinrich August Ossenfelder, a German poet, published Der Vampir. In it, the vampire is not a bloated corpse but a seducer, mocking Christian faith and luring women from prayer to passion. Already, the figure was shifting from peasant terror to romantic metaphor. The vampire had become not only a monster but a rival to God, a tempter, a figure of forbidden desire. By the late 18th century, the word vampire had become fashionable in Western Europe. Writers used it metaphorically to describe exploitative nobles, corrupt officials, or even bankers who drained the poor. Political pamphlets accused opponents of being vampires on the body politic. The word's resonance was too strong to confine to folklore. It carried the sense of draining, of feeding parasitically, and it became a potent metaphor. Yet even as it was used metaphorically, the literal belief persisted. Travelers to Eastern Europe continued to report vampire exhumations. In rural Hungary, Wallachia, and Poland, villagers still performed anti-vampire rituals well into the 19th century. Western readers, hearing of these, oscillated between mockery and fascination. To laugh at the superstition was one thing, to shiver at the thought of it was another. Both reactions kept the vampire alive in the imagination. It is striking how this linguistic journey prepared the ground for later literature. Without the Serbian reports, without the word vampire entering French, German, and English, the Gothic novelists of the 19th century might never have found their central figure. When John Polidori wrote The Vampire in 1819, he could rely on readers recognizing the word. When Bram Stoker titled his novel Dracula in 1897, the subtitle Vampire was unnecessary. The name alone already evoked it. The vampire had been planted in the West long before. But let us return to the 18th century for a moment to feel the pulse of the word as it first spread. Imagine a London coffeehouse in the 1732nd. Gentlemen lean over newspapers, reading aloud the translated Austrian reports. They laugh nervously at peasants who dig up corpses, yet some lower their voices when describing the blood in the mouths of the dead. Or picture a Paris salon, where philosophers debate whether vampires are metaphors for tyranny or actual demons. The word hangs in the air, foreign, strange, thrilling. It carries with it the chill of eastern forests, the superstition of peasants, the authority of imperial documents. The vampire's westward journey is a story of language, but also of imagination. The word itself became a vessel, carrying fears, desires, and metaphors across cultures. It began as oupir, became vampire, then vampire. With each step, it absorbed new meanings, from bloated corpse to seductive aristocrat, from village fear to literary icon. It evolved, but it never lost the chill of the grave. And here we see again how Vlad III's legacy intertwined with folklore. When Western readers later learned of the cruel Prince of Wallachia, whose name meant devil's son, they already had the word vampire in their vocabulary. The two streams converged. Dracula the Impaler, Dracula the devil's son, met vampire the revenant, and together they formed the count who would haunt literature. Without the word's journey west, Vlad might have remained a regional tyrant. With it, he became immortal. Thus, The 18th century gave the vampire more than superstition, it gave it a passport. No longer bound to the Balkans, it crossed into the salons of Paris, the newspapers of London, the metaphors of politics. It became part of Europe's shared imagination, ready for Gothic writers to seize. And once seized, it would never let go. The vampire that crept westward in the 18th century, bloated, bloody, and feared as a corpse that refused to stay down, did not remain that way for long. By the dawn of the 19th century, the Enlightenment had cooled superstition, Romanticism had reawakened imagination, and literature was hungry for figures that embodied both terror and desire. Out of this shifting landscape rose a new kind of vampire, not the grotesque revenant of Serbian graveyards, but the elegant, seductive predator of aristocratic salons. It was in the 19th century that the vampire truly entered modern consciousness, dressed not in burial shrouds but in velvet cloaks, speaking not only of death but of longing. The first great step in this transformation came in 1819 with John Polidori's novella, The Vampire. Its origins are as legendary as the story itself. In 1816, the so-called Year Without a Summer, a volcanic eruption shrouded Europe in strange weather. In Geneva, a group of writers including Lord Byron, Percy Bysshe Shelley, Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, and Byron's physician Polidori gathered at Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva. The gloomy skies, the company of romantic poets, and the challenge of Byron himself, let us each write a ghost story, produced two of the most influential horror tales in Western literature, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and Polidori's The Vampire. Polidori's story was short, published anonymously at first, and often misattributed to Byron. Yet its impact was immense. For the first time, the vampire was no longer a rotting peasant corpse, but an aristocrat. Lord Ruthven. He was suave, charming, pale, and magnetic, a figure who moved easily in polite society. Women were drawn to him, men fascinated and unsettled. Beneath his elegance, however, lay predation. Ruthven seduced, deceived, and drained life from those around him. He embodied not only horror but allure. This change reflected the Romantic era's fascination with forbidden desires, with the blending of beauty and danger. The vampire became less about disease and decomposition, and more about corruption, temptation, and the dark side of passion. He was no longer simply a creature of the grave. He was a mirror for human longing, for the tension between virtue and vice. Lord Ruthven's popularity spread rapidly. Plays were staged across Europe, often credited to Byron rather than Polidori, as Byron's name carried scandalous weight. Audiences thrilled to see the vampire not as grotesque but as noble, embodying the secret fears of high society, that beneath aristocratic manners lurked parasitism, that elegance concealed exploitation. The vampire had become a metaphor for the ruling class, draining the lifeblood of the people, but it was also a symbol of desire, of attraction to what one knew was dangerous. From this seed grew an entire literary tradition. Throughout the 19th century, vampire stories proliferated. They appeared in penny dreadfuls, in serialized magazines, in Gothic novels. The figure shifted with each telling, but the core remained. The vampire was aristocratic, alluring, a predator cloaked in charm. In France, Charles Nodier and others adapted Polidori's tale for the stage, ensuring the vampire remained a presence in the popular imagination. In Germany, Der Vampir became an opera by Heinrich Marschner in 1828, with Lord Ruthven singing his way through seductions and betrayals. In England, James Malcolm Rymer's penny dreadful Varney the Vampire, 1845-1847, offered readers a sprawling, melodramatic saga of Sir Francis Varney, a vampire torn between guilt and hunger. Though often repetitive and sensational, the series fixed many vampire tropes: fangs, bites to the neck, hypnotic influence, and endless resurrection. Varney himself was weary, even sympathetic, a monster cursed as much as cursed. The Victorian period deepened the vampire's romantic and erotic undertones. As society wrestled with strict moral codes, literature explored the shadows beneath. The vampire became a figure of transgression, representing sexuality, decadence, and the fear of moral collapse. To be bitten was not only to die, but to surrender, to yield to forbidden passion. Writers used vampires to hint at what could not be spoken openly: desire between men, female longing, the fear of contagion through sexuality. The vampire was both nightmare and fantasy. One of the most striking examples is Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, published in 1872. Set in a decaying Austrian castle, the story follows a young woman preyed upon by the mysterious Carmilla, who is revealed to be a female vampire. Carmilla's affection is tender, intimate, and unmistakably erotic. The story explores lesbian desire in coded form, unsettling Victorian readers with the suggestion that women could not only love one another, but be corrupted through it. Carmilla is beautiful, tragic, and deadly. Another step in the evolution of the vampire is both seductive and sympathetic. Meanwhile, real-world vampire panics had not entirely vanished. Even in the 19th century, rural communities in Eastern Europe still exhumed bodies, still staked corpses, still whispered of strigoi and upir. Reports of such events made their way into newspapers, often framed as quaint superstitions. Yet for urban readers, they added authenticity to the fictional vampires now populating novels and stage plays. Folklore and literature fed each other, each reinforcing the idea that vampires were both ancient and immediate. By the end of the 19th century, the vampire was ready for its most iconic incarnation. Bram Stoker, an Irish theatre manager and writer, absorbed the entire tradition: the pamphlets of the 18th century, Polidori's aristocratic predator, Varney's melodrama, Carmilla's eroticism, and the older folklore of Eastern Europe. When he published Dracula in 1897, he gave the world not only a novel but a synthesis, a definitive shape to the vampire. But even before Stoker's Count stepped from the shadows, the Romantic century had already transformed the vampire forever. No longer a grotesque peasant revenant, it was now a noble predator, a figure of beauty and dread intertwined. Its bite was not only fatal but intimate. Its presence was not only horrifying but magnetic. The Romantic vampire reveals much about its age. It reflected anxieties about aristocracy exploiting the masses, about sexuality threatening moral order, about desire clashing with restraint. It was at once political metaphor and private fantasy. To read of Lord Ruthven or Carmilla was to tremble not only at death, but at attraction to what society forbade. And so, in the soft telling of tonight's history, we can picture the drawing rooms of 19th century Europe. A young woman hides a penny, dreadful, under her cushion, heart racing at Varney's latest attack. A theatre audience gasps as Lord Ruthven seduces on stage. A reader in Vienna lingers over Carmilla's whispered endearments. Each feels the shiver of fear and the pull of fascination. The vampire has become more than a monster. It has become a mirror for desire, for longing, for the darkness within ourselves. From Polidori's Ruthven to Le Fanu's Carmilla, the Romantic vampire was the bridge between folklore and modern fiction. It was the step that made Stoker's Dracula possible, and it showed that the vampire was not destined only for graveyards. It was destined for the human heart. The story of Dracula, the man, the myth, the vampire, is not one tale but many, layered across centuries like soil upon soil. Beneath it all lies the historical figure of Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, who reigned with cruelty and cunning during the mid-15th century. His forests of the impaled, his scorched earth campaigns against the Ottomans, his ceaseless grasp for power left scars on the land and memories in the people. Yet his political life alone would not have given him immortality. It was the stories, the exaggerations, the whispers of cruelty that grew larger than truth. that carried his name far beyond his small principality. Above that foundation rests the folklore of Eastern Europe, the strigoi of Romania, the upia of Slavic lands, the revenants that villagers blamed for disease, wasting, and death. These were not aristocrats but neighbours, kin, who rose from their graves to prey on the living. Garlic, hawthorn, crosses, and stakes were the tools to defend against them. This was not fiction, but daily belief, practiced in graveyards by torchlight. When Vlad's cruel legend touched this existing folklore, the two streams merged, creating a figure who was both tyrant and revenant, both ruler and restless dead. Then came the 18th century, when Serbian vampire panics drew the attention of Habsburg officials and Western presses. For the first time, the word vampire entered French, German, and English. Suddenly, the revenants of Balkan villages were news in London and Paris. Philosophers scoffed, yet readers devoured the tales. The vampire had crossed borders. The 19th century gave the figure its aristocratic mask. John Polidori's Lord Ruthven, Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, the sprawling melodrama of Varney the Vampire, all recast the vampire as seducer, noble predator, romantic rival. The vampire was no longer a bloated corpse but an alluring figure of temptation. These works reflected anxieties about sexuality, class, and corruption, and in doing so, they prepared the ground for Bram Stoker. In 1897, Stoker fused it all. Dracula took the name of Vlad the Impaler, the fears of contagion, the eroticism of the romantic vampire, the folklore of the strigoi, and wove them into an epistolary novel of invasion and resistance. Count Dracula arrived not only in Whitby Harbour but in the collective imagination of the world. Though Stoker's book was not an instant phenomenon, the 20th century gave it new life. Stage plays, then films, turned Dracula into an icon. Bela Lugosi's Dark Eyes, Christopher Lee's Fangs, countless adaptations in print and screen all ensured that Dracula would never die. The immortality of Dracula lies in adaptability. In each era, he reflects its deepest fears. In the 15th century, he was cruelty incarnate, a tyrant who ruled by terror. In the 18th, he was plague and pestilence, the explanation for epidemics. In the 19th, he was forbidden desire, the shadow of sexuality under moral codes. In the 20th, he was cinematic horror, the monster who lurked in theatres and living rooms. And in the 21st, he continues to evolve, appearing in novels, television series, and films that recast him as villain, anti-hero, even tragic lover. Yet beneath every retelling, one constant remains: blood. Blood as life, blood as curse, blood as desire. From Vlad's impaled corpses to Elizabeth Bathory's alleged baths, from strigoi draining families to Dracula bending women to his will, the theme endures. The vampire is the embodiment of hunger that never ends, the thirst that defines mortality itself. We might ask why this figure endures when so many others fade. Why Dracula, and not some other tyrant or monster? Perhaps it is because Dracula is not only horror but mirror. He shows us our fear of death, our unease with desire, our anxieties about disease and invasion, our suspicion of power. He is always slightly ahead, shifting shape to remain relevant. As long as humans fear, Dracula thrives. And so, in the meditative stillness of tonight's telling, we can picture the long journey of this legend. The torches of Wallachian villagers, watching stakes rise into the air. The presses of Nuremberg and Leipzig printing lurid woodcuts. The candlelit salons of Paris where philosophers debate revenants. The dim stages of London where Lord Ruthven stalks the boards. The desk of Bram Stoker where ink flows into the name Dracula. The flickering light of early cinemas where Lugosi lifts his hand and whispers, "I am Dracula." The chain continues, each link forged by fear, fascination, and imagination. The immortality of Dracula is not in flesh, but in story. He has died 1,000 deaths, staked, burned, driven into the sun, yet he returns each time. He is a reflection of our refusal to let go of fear, our need to embody the darkness in a figure we can name. Vlad the Impaler died in 1476, his grave uncertain, yet Dracula, the legend, has never rested. He walks still, through page and stage, through screen and dream, and perhaps that is the truest secret of immortality: to be remembered, to be retold, to slip beyond the boundary of history into myth. Vlad sought power, Stoker sought a story, and folklore sought an explanation. Together, they gave us Dracula, eternal. And so, the story of Vlad III, of blood-drinking myths, of Stoker's Count, draws to a close. We have wandered from the misty forests of Wallachia to the flickering stages of London, from the torchlit graveyards of Serbia to the darkened theatres where cinema first gave fangs their glow. Along the way, we have seen how history, fear, faith, and imagination braided together into something stronger than any single tale, the immortal figure of Dracula. But now, as the telling softens, let the edges blur. The stakes are lowered, the shadows fade. The clamour of pamphlets, the cries of peasants, the pages of Gothic novels all grow quiet, as though carried off on a night wind. What remains is not terror, but a kind of wonder. Stories survive not because they frighten us, but because they hold a mirror to our deepest selves. Rest easy in knowing that the fears of centuries past are only echoes now. The Strigoi will not scratch at your door. The Upir will not rise from the graveyard. Vlad's horsemen are long gone, and the Count himself remains safely bound in ink and celluloid. They cannot touch you. They are only shapes in story, and story is what gives them life, and what keeps them harmless. So breathe deeply. Let your shoulders unclench. The long journey has ended, and night has grown gentler. Imagine the sound of a soft fan humming in the background, a lull of air to carry you downward into rest. The legends have been told, the fears set aside, and all that remains is stillness. Close your eyes now, drift into that silence. The story is over, the night is yours.